Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy wooden doors of a Victorian mansion where gaslight flickers against ornate wallpaper and the scent of lavender water mingles with something far more mysterious. You find yourself standing in what appears to be an ordinary bedroom, but your eyes begin to notice the subtle irregularities, a section of wall that doesn't quite match the pattern, a floorboard that creaks with intention, and furniture positioned just a little too deliberately to be accidental. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for about why our ancestors lived such carefully constructed double lives. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to share where and when you started watching this video, or perhaps tell me what draws you most to these hidden histories of our past. Your engagement helps these forgotten stories reach others who might find comfort in understanding how complex human nature has always been. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You run your fingers along the silk wallpaper of Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton's bedroom in 1887 London, and beneath the delicate rose pattern, you feel something unexpected. A barely perceptible seam running vertically from floor to ceiling. This isn't decorative, it's functional. Behind this innocent facade lies one of Victorian society's most ingenious solutions to their greatest fear: discovery. The wealthy Pemberton family, like thousands of others across Britain and America, had transformed their most private spaces into elaborate hiding systems. You press gently against the wall, and a section swings inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow compartment lined with velvet. Inside, you discover Mrs. Pemberton's secret collection: passionate love letters from her husband's business partner, a small vial of laudanum, far exceeding any medical prescription, and most shocking of all, a leather-bound journal detailing her involvement in the Underground Railway, helping escaped criminals flee to America. Victorian bedrooms weren't just sleeping quarters, they were command centres for lives that bore no resemblance to public personas. The era's obsession with moral propriety created an environment where even the most respectable citizens needed secure places to hide evidence of their true selves. These secret compartments, known as priest holes in earlier centuries, evolved during the Victorian era into sophisticated concealment systems that would make modern security experts envious. You move to the mahogany wardrobe and discover its false back panel, behind which hang clothes that Mrs. Pemberton could never wear in public: a scarlet silk dress cut daringly low, men's trousers for her secret horseback rides, and a mourning outfit she wore while pretending to grieve a lover who was very much alive. The ingenuity required to create these hiding spaces demanded skilled craftsmen who themselves became keepers of secrets, paid handsomely for their silence and discretion. The construction techniques varied by social class, but the need remained constant. You notice how the floorboards near the window have been carefully modified to lift, revealing a compartment where correspondence could be hidden from prying eyes. Even middle-class families employed these methods, though their secret chambers held different treasures, perhaps a bottle of gin in a temperance household, or books on subjects deemed inappropriate for women's consumption. Professional secret keepers emerged as a cottage industry during this period. Master carpenters developed specializations in creating these concealed spaces, advertising discreetly through word-of-mouth networks. They charged premium rates for work that often required them to return at night, building hidden compartments while families slept. These craftsmen understood that their clients' lives depended on their skill and silence. Some commanded salaries equivalent to doctors or lawyers. Such was the value placed on their unique abilities. You examine the elaborate dressing table, and your trained eye notices that one drawer extends slightly less than the others. Sliding it completely out reveals a second compartment behind, where Mrs. Pemberton kept her most dangerous possessions: photographs that could destroy marriages, financial documents revealing illegal investments, and correspondence with known anarchists, Victorian women, despite their restricted legal status, often served as the family's unofficial intelligence officers, gathering and storing information that could prove valuable or devastating. The psychology behind these hiding places reveals the era's fundamental contradiction between public morality and private reality. Historians still argue whether Victorians were genuinely more moral than previous generations, or simply more skilled at concealing their transgressions. The evidence suggests the latter. The sophistication of their concealment methods indicates not occasional lapses in judgment, but systematic double lives requiring careful planning and execution. Temperature and humidity control in these secret spaces became crucial considerations. You notice small holes drilled through walls to prevent moisture buildup that might damage hidden documents. Victorian engineers even developed rudimentary ventilation systems for larger hiding spaces, ensuring that sensitive materials could survive years of concealment. The attention to detail rivaled that given to bank vaults, with some families installing primitive dehumidification systems using salt crystals and charcoal filters. The servants presented the greatest security risk to these elaborate deceptions. Housemaids cleaning rooms daily would inevitably discover signs of the hidden compartments. This reality led to an entire shadow economy where domestic staff supplemented their wages through strategic blindness to their employers' secrets. You can imagine the careful negotiations that took place: a slight increase in wages, an extra day off monthly, or simply the understanding that discretion was part of the job description. Some families went to extraordinary lengths to protect their secrets, creating multiple layers of deception. You discover that Mrs. Pemberton's obvious hiding places contained relatively minor infractions: betting receipts, empty perfume bottles from France, designed to satisfy curious servants while protecting the truly damaging evidence stored in deeper, more sophisticated compartments. This psychological misdirection proved remarkably effective, much like a magician's use of distraction to conceal the real trick. The most successful secret chambers often incorporated existing architectural features. You notice how the bedroom's ornate crown moulding conceals a horizontal compartment running the room's perimeter. Victorian architects began incorporating these features into new construction, understanding that wealthy clients required more than just luxury. They needed security for their secrets. The line between architecture and espionage blurred in ways that would have impressed Cold War intelligence agencies. You discover evidence of international networks among the craftsmen who built these hiding places. Techniques developed in London spread to New York, then to San Francisco during the Gold Rush. Each region adapted the methods to local building styles and materials, creating a global underground of concealment specialists. Some of the most elaborate systems were found in American frontier mansions, where newly wealthy industrialists had the most to hide from their rough-hewn pasts. The tools required for accessing these compartments became family heirlooms in their own right. You find Mrs. Pemberton's collection of specially crafted keys, hidden springs, and pressure-sensitive mechanisms. Some families developed elaborate rituals around opening their secret chambers, treating the process with a religious solemnity. Children were initiated into these mysteries at specific ages, sworn to secrecy with ceremonies that rivaled Masonic traditions. The economics of concealment created entire supply chains dedicated to secrecy, specialized locksmiths, upholsterers who understood how to create false backs in furniture, and even chemists who developed inks that would fade if exposed to unauthorized light. The Victorian era's Industrial Revolution had an unexpected beneficiary: the business of keeping secrets. As you prepare to leave Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom, running your hands along surfaces that conceal more than they reveal, you realize that every family photograph, every piece of furniture, every decorative element served dual purposes in Victorian domestic life. The bedroom wasn't just where they slept, it was where they stored the evidence of who they really were when society wasn't watching. The very architecture of respectability was built upon a foundation of carefully hidden truths. You step deeper into the shadows of Mrs. Pemberton's bedrooms, where the air grows heavier with the scent of wilted flowers and something else. The unmistakable presence of death that has lingered in this room for 3 days. The elaborate 4-poster bed, draped in black crepe and surrounded by flickering candles, holds not a sleeping figure but the carefully arranged body of Adelaide's youngest daughter, 7-year-old Constance, whose pale hands clutch a bouquet of white roses that will never wilt as quickly as she did. Victorian families didn't simply mourn their dead, they transformed their most intimate spaces into elaborate theatres of grief, where the deceased became the centrepiece of rituals so complex they required instruction manuals. You witness how ordinary bedrooms metamorphosed into sacred spaces that would have been unrecognisable to earlier generations, where death was merely an unfortunate interruption to daily life rather than its temporary focal point. The custom of laying out the dead in the family bedroom originated from practical necessity, but evolved into something far more psychologically complex. In an era before funeral homes, families had little choice but to prepare bodies themselves. But Victorians elevated this necessity into an art form that revealed their deepest anxieties about mortality, social status, and the afterlife. You observe how Constance has been positioned with meticulous care. Her hair arranged in perfect ringlets, her finest dress pressed and layered with lace, her face painted with rouge to simulate the bloom of life. Professional mourning consultants emerged to guide families through these elaborate rituals. Mrs. Pemberton has employed such a specialist, a severe woman named Miss Hartwell, who arrives with cases full of specialized equipment, hair pomade formulated specifically for the deceased, cosmetics designed to withstand days of viewing, and an array of positioning devices to maintain dignified poses. These mourning entrepreneurs commanded substantial fees, understanding that grief made families vulnerable to any promise of propriety and remembrance. You notice the bedroom's transformation extends far beyond the central display. Every mirror has been covered with black cloth, following the superstition that spirits might become trapped in reflective surfaces. The windows are draped so heavily that day and night become indistinguishable, creating a timeless space where normal rules of living no longer apply. Family members take turns sitting vigil, maintaining constant watch over Constance's body while neighbours and relatives parade through in carefully choreographed visits. The mourning bed itself became a canvas for displaying family wealth and social connections. You observe how Adelaide has arranged expensive flowers in patterns that communicate specific messages: white roses for purity, forget-me-nots for remembrance, rosemary for eternal love. Each bloom carries meaning in the complex language of Victorian mourning, and visitors would read these floral arrangements like texts, understanding immediately the family's financial status and emotional sophistication. Temperature control presented unique challenges during these extended bedroom vigils. Despite the prevalence of ice houses among wealthy families, maintaining proper conditions for viewing required constant attention. You notice the discreet placement of ice-filled containers hidden beneath the bed's draped platform, changed every few hours by servants who moved through the room like ghosts themselves. The art of preserving bodies for extended viewing became a specialized skill passed down through generations of undertakers' assistants. Historians still argue whether these prolonged bedroom vigils served psychological healing or prolonged trauma for surviving family members. Contemporary medical journals from the 1880s reveal heated debates about the health implications of sleeping in rooms where bodies had lain for days. But social pressure typically overruled medical concerns. Families who curtailed mourning rituals risked social ostracism, more devastating than any potential physical illness. The economic implications of bedroom mourning created entire industries dedicated to death. You discover Mrs. Russ Pemberton's collection of specialized mourning furniture, chairs designed for extended vigil sitting, tables crafted specifically for displaying memorial items, and even chamber pots decorated with angels for the practical needs of round-the-clock mourning. Furniture makers advertised mourning suites and catalogues, understanding that death could be remarkably profitable for those positioned to serve grief. Photography played an increasingly important role in these bedroom death scenes. You notice the careful positioning of lighting equipment near Constance's bed, preparation for what may be the only photograph ever taken of the child. These post-mortem portraits, known as mourning photographs or memento mori, often represented families' most significant photographic investment. Professional photographers specializing in death imagery commanded premium rates and developed techniques for creating lifelike poses that suggested peaceful sleep rather than death. The social hierarchy of mourning visits followed strict protocols that transformed bedrooms into complex social theatres. You observe how the room's seating arrangement indicates the precise social ranking of expected visitors, the most honoured chairs positioners closest to the deceased. Lesser seating arranged in careful gradations of distance and comfort, these spatial relationships communicated family politics with the precision of royal court protocol. Children's participation in bedroom mourning rituals varied dramatically by family philosophy and social class. Some Victorian parents believed early exposure to death provided valuable moral instruction, while others worried about psychological damage. You witness how the Pemberton family has included their surviving children in the vigil rotation, requiring them to spend specific hours sitting quietly beside Constance's body, learning what they were expected to consider natural and necessary. Religious variations in mourning practices created fascinating hybrid rituals in Victorian bedrooms. Protestant families emphasized personal grief and family intimacy, while Catholic households incorporated more formal liturgical elements. Jewish families adapted traditional sitting shiva to bedroom settings, while newer spiritual movements like spiritualism transformed mourning into elaborate communication attempt with the deceased. These religious differences played out in the physical arrangement of bedroom spaces and the specific rituals performed within them. The servant's role in maintaining mourning bedrooms created unique labour categories within Victorian households. Specialised mourning servants commanded higher wages and worked under conditions that would challenge modern grief counsellors. You observe how these workers move through the death-filled bedroom with professional detachment, maintaining candles, refreshing flowers, and managing the physical realities of decomposition, while families focused on emotional and social performance. International variations in bedroom mourning revealed fascinating cultural exchanges during the Victorian era. American families often extended British customs with frontier practicality, creating hybrid rituals adapted to different climates and social structures. British expatriate families in India developed mourning practices that incorporated local traditions while maintaining European social expectations. These cultural fusings created unique bedroom death rituals found nowhere else in the world. The conclusion of bedroom mourning required elaborate transition ceremonies that restored domestic spaces to their normal functions. You witnessed the careful process of dismantling Constance's memorial display, flowers distributed to honoured guests, mourning decorations stored for future use, and the bed itself blessed or purified before returning to everyday use. Some families never fully recovered their bedrooms from mourning, maintaining permanent shrines that transformed domestic spaces into lifelong memorial sites. As the final mourners file past Constance's carefully arranged form, you realise that Victorian bedroom mourning rituals revealed far more about the living than the dead. These elaborate productions served multiple functions, displaying social status, managing community relationships, and providing structured outlets for grief that might otherwise prove socially disruptive. The bedroom became a stage where families performed their deepest values while processing their most profound losses. You open the mahogany medicine cabinet beside Mrs. Pemberton's bed, and the contents would horrify any modern physician. Rows of gleaming bottles containing liquids so dangerous they could kill faster than the ailments they supposedly treated. The sweet, cloying scent of opium mingles with the sharp bite of mercury, while colourful powders promise miraculous cures that delivered only addiction, organ failure, and slow, agonising death. Victorian medicine cabinets represented humanity's most dangerous intersection of good intentions and lethal ignorance. You lift a bottle labelled Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup for Teething Children, a popular remedy containing enough morphine to sedate a grown man, routinely administered to infants whose only crime was the natural discomfort of growing teeth. The Victorian era's unregulated pharmaceutical landscape created a perfect storm where anyone could manufacture and sell liquid death disguised as healing. The patent medicine industry exploded during the 1800s, transforming bedroom medicine cabinets into museums of medical horror. You examine bottles of cocaine toothache drops, marketed cheerfully to children with colourful labels depicting happy families. These weren't isolated cases of medical malpractice. They represented a systematic poisoning of entire generations who trusted in scientific progress while lacking any regulatory framework to protect them from entrepreneurial predators. Professional physicians of the era often proved more dangerous than patent medicine peddlers. You discover Dr. Morrison's personal treatment kit, used during house calls to the Pemberton family, containing mercury-based compounds for treating everything from depression to digestive complaints. Mercury poisoning symptoms, tremors, personality changes, and organ failure were frequently misdiagnosed as separate ailments requiring additional mercury treatments, creating deadly cycles of pharmaceutical torture disguised as medical care. The electromagnetic therapy devices scattered throughout the bedroom represent Victorian medicine's bizarre fusion of scientific discovery and magical thinking. You examine an elaborate contraption called a Pulvermacher's patent galvanic chain, a wearable device that supposedly channeled healing electrical currents through the wearer's body. These expensive gadgets, costing equivalent to several months' wages, delivered nothing more than mild electrical shocks while promising cures for conditions ranging from impotence to tuberculosis. Women's medicine cabinets revealed particularly disturbing contents, reflecting the era's profound misunderstanding of female anatomy and psychology. You find bottles of female-regulating pills containing dangerous levels of lead and mercury, marketed as treatments for the mysterious ailment Victorian doctors called female hysteria. These supposed remedies often cause the very symptoms they claim to cure, trapping women in cycles of medication dependency that modern medicine recognizes as systematic poisoning. The Victorian obsession with strengthening tonics created an entire industry built around liquid addiction. You discover Mrs. Pemberton's collection of patent tonics, each containing alcohol concentrations that would make modern whiskey blush. Hostetta's celebrated stomach bitters contain nearly 50% alcohol, marketed as a health tonic suitable for children and temperance advocates. These medicines created generations of functional alcoholics who genuinely believed they were pursuing health and virtue. Arsenic-based beauty treatments occupied prime positions in Victorian ladies' medicine cabinets. You examine delicate glass vials containing Dr. Mackenzie's improved harmless arsenic complexion wafers, promised to deliver the pale, ethereal beauty Victorian society prized. Women consumed these poison tablets daily. Developing the ghostly pallor was actually a sign of chronic arsenic poisoning. The beauty ideal of the era was literally the appearance of slow death. Children's medications represented perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Victorian medicine cabinets. You find Godfrey's cordial, a popular children's remedy containing opium, treacle, and spices, administered to infants as young as 6 months old for conditions ranging from colic to general fussiness. Historians still argue whether the period's high infant mortality rates resulted from disease or from well-intentioned parents slowly poisoning their children with pharmaceutical weapons disguised as healing remedies. The opium-based preparations dominating Victorian medicine cabinets created the world's first mass addiction crisis. You examine bottles of laudanum, liquid opium dissolved in alcohol suppository, prescribed for ailments as varied as headaches, menstrual cramps, and insomnia. Respectable Victorian ladies consumed quantities of opium that would shock modern drug rehabilitation specialists, all while maintaining their social positions as paragons of moral virtue. The bedroom medicine cabinet became ground zero for an addiction epidemic that destroyed families while pretending to heal them. Dental care products in Victorian bedrooms revealed medicine's dangerous ignorance about basic human anatomy. You discover tooth powders containing enough lead to cause permanent brain damage, mouthwashes with mercury concentrations that destroyed gums and jawbones, and tooth extraction tools that homeowners used on family members without any understanding of infection control. Victorian dental hygiene practices often caused more damage than complete neglect would have achieved. The era's diagnostic equipment, proudly displayed in wealthy bedrooms, combined impressive craftsmanship with complete medical uselessness. You examine an ornate phrenology measuring device used to diagnose mental conditions by analysing skull shape and size. These pseudoscientific instruments commanded enormous prices, while delivering diagnoses as accurate as random guessing. Yet they provided Victorian families with the comforting illusion that their suffering had scientific explanations and rational treatments. International variations in bedroom medicine revealed fascinating cultural exchanges that spread dangerous practices across continents. British colonial families in India adopted local remedies without understanding their proper applications, while Indian practitioners incorporated European medicines without recognizing their toxicity. You discover evidence of these pharmaceutical cultural exchanges in medicine cabinets containing hybrid remedies that combine the worst aspects of multiple medical traditions. the preservation and storage of Victorian medicines created additional health hazards beyond their intended contents. You notice how many bottles show signs of chemical reactions between incompatible compounds stored in close proximity. Glass containers often leached additional toxins into already dangerous preparations, while cork stoppers allowed evaporation that concentrated poisons to even more lethal levels. The medicine cabinet itself became a chemistry lab conducting uncontrolled experiments in human poisoning. Professional medical consultation in Victorian bedrooms followed protocols that would violate every principle of modern medical ethics. You observe the examination tools left behind by Dr. Morrison, instruments used on multiple patients without any cleaning between uses, spreading diseases faster than they could diagnose them. The era's complete ignorance of germ theory meant that medical professionals served as efficient disease vectors while genuinely believing they provided healing services. The economic implications of Victorian medicine created perverse incentives that prioritized profit over patient welfare. You discover receipts showing that Mrs. Pemberton spent more on useless and dangerous medications than most working families earned in entire years. The patent medicine industry understood that chronic conditions generated more revenue than actual cures, designing products that created dependency while providing just enough temporary relief to maintain customer loyalty. The psychological impact of these elaborate medical rituals often exceeded any physical benefits the treatments might have provided. Victorian families invested enormous emotional energy in their medicine cabinet rituals, finding comfort in the illusion of scientific control over unpredictable ailments. You realize that these bedroom pharmaceutical ceremonies served important psychological functions even when their medical value proved worse than useless. As you close the medicine cabinet, your hands trembling slightly from handling substances that murdered more Victorians than any war or plague, you understand that these bedroom collections represent humanity's most dangerous combination of good intentions and profound ignorance. The Victorian medicine cabinet stands as a monument to the era's touching faith in progress and their tragic inability to distinguish between scientific advancement and elaborate self-destruction. You notice a slight rustle behind the bedroom door and realize you're not alone. A young housemaid named Sarah stands motionless in the shadows, her trained eyes cataloguing every detail of your exploration through Mrs. Pemberton's secret compartments. She doesn't speak, doesn't move, but you understand immediately that she has witnessed everything, recorded everything, and will remember everything. Welcome to the Victorian era's most sophisticated intelligence network. Operated not by government spies but by an army of seemingly invisible servants whose survival depended on knowing exactly what their employers were hiding. Victorian domestic servants functioned as the era's most effective surveillance system, their unique position within wealthy households providing access to secrets that could topple governments, destroy marriages, and ruin reputations overnight. You observe how Sarah positions herself to overhear conversations through heating grates, how she times her cleaning to coincide with private meetings, and how she reads correspondence while pretending to dust furniture. These weren't accidents or curiosity. They were professional survival skills in a world where knowledge equaled job security and ignorance could mean immediate dismissal without references. The bedroom became the epicenter of this domestic espionage network because it contained the most intimate evidence of employers' true characters. You watch Sarah methodically examine Mrs. Pemberton's nightstand, noting the level of laudanum in medicine bottles, counting the hidden love letters, and observing which books show signs of recent reading. She mentally catalogues these details not from malicious intent, but from the practical understanding that her employer's secrets might become her most valuable currency in times of crisis. Servants developed sophisticated methods for gathering and preserving intelligence without leaving evidence of their surveillance activities. You discover Sarah's personal journal, hidden beneath her mattress in the servants' quarters, containing a detailed record of household secrets written in a simple code she learned from other maids. The information ranges from Mrs. Pemberton's gambling debts to Mr. Pemberton's meetings with radical political organisers, each entry carefully dated and cross-referenced with potential witnesses or corroborating evidence. The economics of servant surveillance created complex power dynamics that inverted traditional class relationships. Sarah earns £12 annually as a housemaid, but her knowledge of the Pemberton family's secrets makes her effectively untouchable despite her low social status. You observe how she leverages this information subtly, never through direct blackmail, which would be too dangerous, but through strategic demonstrations of loyalty that ensure favourable treatment and job security. Communication networks among servants created information exchanges that rivaled modern intelligence agencies in their reach and efficiency. You discover evidence of Sarah's correspondence with maids in neighbouring households, sharing intelligence about their respective employers' activities. These servant networks could track scandals across entire neighbourhoods, monitoring affairs, financial troubles, and criminal activities with precision that would impress professional investigators. The training required to become an effective servant spy began in childhood for many domestic workers. You observe how Sarah mentors younger maids, teaching them to read upside-down correspondence, to identify different handwriting styles, and to memorize conversations word for word without appearing to listen. These skills weren't taught in any formal school, but passed down through generations of servants who understood that survival in wealthy households required intelligence-gathering capabilities. Female servants possessed unique advantages in Victorian surveillance networks because their gender rendered them effectively invisible to male employers. You watch how Sarah moves through the bedroom while Mr. Pemberton conducts business meetings, her presence so routine that men discuss sensitive matters as if she were furniture. This systematic underestimation of women's intelligence and agency created unprecedented opportunities for gathering information that powerful men assumed remained private. The psychological toll of maintaining constant surveillance created complex emotional dynamics between servants and employers. You notice how Sarah struggles with genuine affection for Mrs. Pemberton, while simultaneously documenting her employer's most damaging secrets. The intimate nature of bedroom service, helping with dressing, preparing private meals, maintaining personal hygiene, created relationships that blurred lines between professional duty and personal loyalty. Religious and moral complications arose when servant surveillance revealed information that challenged their own ethical beliefs. Sarah's journal reveals her distress upon discovering evidence of Mr. Pemberton's involvement in child labour schemes, creating conflicts between her financial dependence on the family and her moral objections to their activities. Historians still argue whether servants' complicity in their employers' crimes through silence made them accessories or victims of economic coercion. The technology available to Victorian servants for gathering intelligence was surprisingly sophisticated despite the era's limitations. You discover Sarah's collection of specialized tools, a small mirror for reading correspondence reflection, cotton treated with chemicals to take impressions of keys, and even a primitive listening device constructed from household items. These improvised surveillance tools required ingenuity and mechanical skill that challenged stereotypes about servants' intellectual capabilities. International variations in servant surveillance reflected different cultural attitudes toward privacy and class relationships. British servants operated within stricter hierarchical frameworks that limited their mobility but provided clear protection protocols, while American domestic workers enjoyed greater personal freedom but faced more arbitrary dismissal policies. You find evidence that Sarah corresponds with a cousin working in New York, comparing surveillance techniques and employment strategies across different social systems. The legal implications of servant surveillance created fascinating grey areas in Victorian jurisprudence. Servants possessed no legal standing to testify against employers in most circumstances, but their knowledge could be used by third parties pursuing civil or criminal cases. You discover correspondence showing how Sarah was approached by Mr. Pemberton's business rivals, offering payment for information about his private dealings. These offers created ethical dilemmas that servants navigated without any legal protection or professional guidance. Professional specialization emerged among servants who demonstrated exceptional surveillance capabilities. You learn that Sarah plans to transition from general housemaid to lady's maid, a position that would provide even greater access to intimate secrets while commanding higher wages. The most skilled servant spies could command premium salaries and choose their employers. Understanding that their intelligence-gathering abilities made them valuable assets in wealthy households' complex social competitions. The documentation methods servants used to preserve gathered intelligence required careful balance between accuracy and safety. Sarah's coding system uses household items as metaphors for people and activities. Silver needs polishing indicates financial problems, while roses require pruning suggests romantic entanglements. These domestic codes allowed servants to maintain detailed records while providing plausible explanations if their journals were discovered by employers or authorities. Retirement planning for servant spies involved complex calculations about when to deploy their accumulated intelligence for maximum benefit. You observe how Sarah carefully preserves the most damaging information about the Pemberton family, understanding that this knowledge might serve as insurance against unfair dismissal or provide leverage for securing better positions with other employers. The bedroom secrets she guards represent her only form of financial security in a world that offered servants no retirement benefits or job protection. The psychological profile required for successful servant surveillance combined contradictory personality traits that created unique individuals capable of intimate deception. Sarah exhibits extraordinary patience, perfect memory, and remarkable emotional control while maintaining the appearance of simple domestic competence. You realize that the Victorian era's most effective spies wore aprons instead of evening clothes and operated from servants' quarters rather than diplomatic embassies. As Sarah finally melts back into the shadows, having completed her evening reconnaissance of the Pemberton bedroom, you understand that she represents thousands of Victorian servants who possessed intimate knowledge of their era's most powerful families. These domestic intelligence networks shaped political decisions, influenced business dealings, and determined social hierarchies through information gathered in bedrooms that their employers believed were private and secure. You catch the sweet, heavy scent of something burning in Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom that isn't tobacco. It's the distinctive aroma of opium curling upward from an ornate silver pipe. Hidden behind the velvet curtains of her four-poster, the respectable Victorian matron who hosts charity teas and condemns the moral failings of the working class is, at this very moment, preparing her third pipe of the evening, her glazed eyes reflecting the gaslight as she transforms her private chamber into what authorities would recognize as an illegal drug den. The opium epidemic that devastated Victorian society didn't confine itself to the squalid dens of London's East End. It flourished in the silk-draped bedrooms of the era's most respectable families, hidden behind locked doors and social pretensions that made detection nearly impossible. You observe Mrs. Pemberton's elaborate smoking apparatus, ivory-handled pipes imported from China, silver spirit lamps for heating the drug, and delicate porcelain containers holding enough processed opium to supply a commercial establishment for weeks. Victorian physicians prescribed opium-based preparations for ailments ranging from menstrual cramps to melancholy, creating legitimate pathways to addiction that ensnared victims before they understood their predicament. Mrs. Pemberton's medicine cabinet contains multiple prescriptions for laudanum, paregoric, and Dover's powder, all legal opium preparations that allowed her to maintain substantial daily consumption while appearing to follow medical advice. The line between medicine and recreational drug use blurred beyond recognition in wealthy Victorian bedrooms. The economics of private opium consumption required substantial financial resources that only the wealthy could sustain. You examine Mrs. Pemberton's hidden accounting ledger, revealing monthly opium expenditures exceeding the annual wages of her servants. These private drug habits created shadow economies where respectable merchants supplied illegal substances to their social peers. Understanding that discretion commanded premium prices and that exposure could destroy everyone involved. International trade networks supplied Victorian bedroom opium dens through channels that paralleled legitimate commerce. You discover correspondence between Mrs. de Pemberton and merchants in Hong Kong, using coded language to arrange shipments of medicinal supplies that arrive hidden within legitimate cargo. These private importation schemes operated alongside the massive opium trade that enriched British merchants while devastating Chinese society, creating moral contradictions that Victorian users resolved through willful ignorance. The social rituals surrounding private opium consumption developed their own elaborate protocols that mimicked respectable Victorian entertainments. Mrs. Pemberton hosts discreet evening medicinal sessions for select female friends, gatherings that combined drug consumption with gossip exchange and mutual protection from discovery. You observe the careful preparation these events required, servants dismissed early, windows sealed against telltale aromas, and elaborate alibis prepared for absent husbands. Women's opium addiction in Victorian bedrooms reflected broader patterns of female oppression disguised as medical treatment. Doctors routinely prescribed opium-based remedies for female complaints that included everything from assertiveness to intellectual curiosity, effectively medicating women who challenged social expectations. Mrs. Pemberton's addiction began with treatments for nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that pathologized her frustration with domestic confinement while providing a socially acceptable explanation for her increasing drug dependence. The physical transformation of bedrooms to accommodate opium use required careful planning to maintain appearances while ensuring comfort during extended drug sessions. You notice how Mrs. Pemberton has modified her bedroom furniture. Extra cushions positioned for comfortable reclining, special ventilation installed to manage smoke, and hidden compartments for storing drug paraphernalia. The room functions as both respectable domestic space and sophisticated drug consumption facility. Children's exposure to parental opium use created generational addiction patterns that Victorian families rarely acknowledged or addressed. You observe evidence that the Pemberton children have been given soothing syrups containing opium since infancy, creating early tolerance that predisposed them to adult addiction. The nursery adjoining the master bedroom contains its own collection of opium-based children's medicines, suggesting that entire families consume these drugs as routine household supplies. Professional enablers emerged to support wealthy families' private drug consumption while maintaining social respectability. Mrs. Pemberton employs a discreet physician, Dr. Whitmore, who provides house calls specifically to manage her medicinal needs without asking uncomfortable questions. These corruption relationships created networks of professionals who profited from addiction, while providing the medical legitimacy that allowed wealthy users to avoid confronting their dependents. The psychological denial mechanisms that allowed respectable Victorians to maintain opium habits while condemning drug use in others reveal fascinating self-deception capabilities. Mrs. Pemberton genuinely believes her consumption represents medical treatment rather than recreational drug use, a distinction she maintains despite consuming quantities that would incapacitate casual users. This cognitive dissonance allowed entire social classes to participate in behaviours they publicly condemned in others. Historians still argue whether Victorian opium addiction rates actually exceeded those of later periods, or whether better documentation simply makes the problem more visible to modern researchers. The evidence suggests that opium consumption among wealthy Victorians reached levels that would be considered epidemic by contemporary standards, but social stigma prevented accurate reporting of addiction rates among respectable families. International variations in opium accessibility created fascinating geographical differences in Victorian addiction patterns. British families in colonial territories had access to cheaper, more potent preparations than their domestic counterparts, while American families relied more heavily on patent medicines containing opium derivatives. You discover that Mrs. Pemberton corresponds with relatives in India who send particularly pure opium samples, suggesting that colonial connections provided superior drug access for connected families. The technology of opium consumption evolved rapidly during the Victorian era as users developed more efficient delivery methods and more discreet consumption techniques. Mrs. Pemberton's equipment represents the latest innovations in private drug use: self-heating pipes that required no external flame, concentrated preparations that minimized telltale smoke, and timing devices that helped regulate dosage. These technological improvements made bedroom opium use more practical and less detectable. Gender differences in Victorian opium consumption patterns reflected broader social dynamics around women's autonomy and medical authority. Female addiction often remained hidden within domestic spaces and medicalized through gynecological complaints, while male users were more likely to access opium through social clubs and commercial establishments. Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom represents the feminine side of Victorian drug culture, where addiction wore the mask of medical compliance and domestic responsibility. The religious implications of opium use created complex theological debates within Victorian households where drug consumption coexisted with strong Christian beliefs. Mrs. Pemberton maintains active church membership while consuming substances that her denomination would consider sinful, resolving this contradiction through elaborate rationalizations about divine providence and medical necessity. These spiritual accommodations allowed religious families to maintain both faith and addiction without experiencing conscious hypocrisy. Legal loopholes in Victorian drug regulation created environments where opium consumption remained technically legal, even when quantities clearly exceeded medical necessity. Mrs. Pemberton's purchases fall within legal limits because she obtains multiple prescriptions from different physicians, creating paper trails that suggest legitimate medical treatment while enabling substantial recreational consumption. These regulatory gaps allowed widespread addiction to flourish within legal frameworks. The social consequences of discovery created powerful incentives for maintaining secrecy around bedroom opium use. You examine correspondence revealing Mrs. Pemberton's terror of exposure. understanding that public knowledge of her addiction would destroy her family's social position and potentially lead to criminal prosecution. This fear drove increasingly elaborate concealment efforts that transformed her bedroom into a fortress of deception designed to protect both her addiction and her reputation. As you watch Mrs. Pemberton sink into the dreamy stupor that marks successful opium consumption, her respectable facade dissolving into the glazed contentment of pharmaceutical escape, you realize that Victorian bedroom drug dens represented more than simple addiction. They revealed the era's profound contradictions between public morality and private desperation, creating spaces where society's most privileged members pursued the same chemical escape they condemned in society's victims. You discover a leather-bound volume hidden beneath Mrs. Pemberton's mattress, its cover bearing no title but emanating the unmistakable aura of forbidden knowledge. Opening to a random page, you're confronted with explicit illustrations and prose so scandalous that possession alone could result in imprisonment, social exile, and complete family disgrace. This isn't an isolated transgression, it's evidence of a vast underground literary network that transformed Victorian bedrooms into secret libraries where society's most forbidden texts circulated through channels more sophisticated than any modern book club. The Victorian era's official moral crusades against obscene literature created a thriving black market that operated primarily through bedroom-based distribution networks. You examine Mrs. Pemberton's hidden collection, discovering works ranging from French novels deemed too passionate for English sensibilities to medical texts describing human sexuality with scientific frankness that challenged religious doctrine. These books carried risk levels equivalent to treason, yet they passed from bedroom to bedroom through networks that included bishops' wives, parliamentarians' daughters, and industrialists' mothers. Professional book smugglers emerged to serve wealthy Victorian families' appetite for forbidden literature, developing distribution systems that rivaled modern drug trafficking operations in their sophistication and secrecy. You find evidence of Mrs. Pemberton's relationship with Mr. Fitzroy, a discreet gentleman who arrives monthly with concealed packages containing the latest banned publications from Paris, Amsterdam, and New York. These literary contraband dealers commanded enormous fees while providing services that could destroy both seller and buyer if discovered. Women's participation in forbidden reading networks challenged Victorian assumptions about female intellectual capacity and moral nature. Mrs. Pemberton's collection includes works on birth control, female anatomy, and women's rights that were banned specifically to prevent female readers from accessing dangerous ideas about their own bodies and social positions. You observe marginalia in her books revealing sophisticated analytical thinking that contradicts the era's official beliefs about women's limited intellectual capabilities. The international scope of Victorian forbidden book networks created fascinating cultural exchanges that spread dangerous ideas across national boundaries. Mrs. Pemberton's library includes German philosophical works arguing against religious authority, French novels celebrating sexual freedom, and American treatises promoting racial equality, all ideas that threatened the foundations of British Victorian society. These bedroom libraries served as conduits for international intellectual revolution disguised as private entertainment. Religious variations in banned book consumption revealed complex negotiations between faith and curiosity within Victorian households. Mrs. Pemberton, a practicing Anglican, owns books that directly challenge Christian doctrine, yet she reconciles this contradiction through elaborate theological rationalizations recorded in her private journal. You discover her detailed arguments defending intellectual exploration as divine gift, suggesting that forbidden reading often strengthened rather than weakened religious conviction by forcing believers to examine their faith more deeply. The preservation methods required for maintaining illegal book collections demanded considerable technical knowledge about paper conservation, binding repair, and concealment techniques. You observe how Mrs. Pemberton has invested in specialized storage equipment, humidity-controlled containers, acid-free papers for wrapping, and even primitive fire suppression systems to protect her valuable contraband. These preservation efforts reveal the enormous value Victorian readers placed on access to forbidden knowledge. Children's exposure to their parents' hidden libraries created educational opportunities that challenged official Victorian pedagogical approaches. You find evidence that Mrs. Pemberton's teenage daughter has accessed the forbidden collection, leading to frank mother-daughter conversations about sexuality, politics, and religion that would have scandalized contemporary educators. These informal education networks operating through bedroom libraries often provided more comprehensive and honest instruction than any formal schooling available to Victorian youth. The economics of forbidden book circulation created complex value systems where intellectual content commanded prices far exceeding those of legal publications. Mrs. Pemberton's accounting records reveal payments for single books that exceeded the cost of entire legal libraries, reflecting both scarcity value and risk premiums associated with contraband literature. These economic dynamics created artificial markets where ideas became luxury commodities accessible only to wealthy consumers willing to pay premium prices for dangerous knowledge. Professional book censors employed by religious and governmental authorities developed increasingly sophisticated detection methods that transformed bedroom searching into a specialized investigative skill. You discover evidence that Mrs. Pemberton's house has been discreetly searched by officials looking for banned literature, requiring her to develop even more elaborate concealment techniques. This escalating arms race between censors and readers drove innovation in both book hiding and book detection technologies. The psychological impact of reading forbidden literature and bedroom secrecy created unique intellectual experiences that combined guilty pleasure with genuine learning. Mrs. Pemberton's journal describes the complex emotions associated with consuming banned books: excitement at accessing prohibited knowledge, fear of discovery, and intellectual satisfaction from engaging with challenging ideas. These emotional combinations created powerful associations between transgression and learning that shaped Victorian intellectual development in ways mainstream education never achieved. Historians still argue whether Victorian forbidden book networks actually promoted dangerous social change or provided harmless outlets for intellectual rebellion that ultimately strengthened existing power structures by allowing controlled transgression. The evidence suggests that bedroom-based reading circles created spaces for questioning authority without necessarily translating private doubt into public action, possibly serving as safety valves that reduced rather than increased revolutionary pressure. Female authorship of forbidden literature created additional layers of transgression that challenged both literary conventions and gender expectations. Mrs. Pemberton owns several books written by women using male pseudonyms, including works on topics that women supposedly couldn't understand or shouldn't discuss. These female-authored forbidden texts represented double violations of censorship laws and gender norms, making them particularly dangerous and valuable to Victorian bedroom libraries. The technology required for reproducing forbidden books created cottage industries that operated entirely within domestic spaces. You discover evidence that Mrs. Pemberton participates in hand-copying rare banned texts, creating duplicate copies for circulation among trusted friends. These domestic reproduction networks ensured that forbidden knowledge survived official suppression efforts, while creating employment opportunities for Victorian women with strong literary skills. International legal variations in book censorship created fascinating opportunities for Victorian readers to access different categories of forbidden literature depending on their travel capabilities and international connections. Mrs. Pemberton's correspondence reveals arrangements with contacts in France and Germany who acquire books legal in those countries but banned in Britain, creating transnational smuggling networks that operated through bedroom-to-bedroom distribution chains. The social consequences of discovery created elaborate mutual protection systems among Victorian forbidden book readers. You find evidence of formal agreements between Mrs. Pemberton and her reading circle partners, establishing protocols for protecting each other if authorities discovered anyone's illegal library. These mutual aid societies operated like insurance companies, spreading risk among multiple participants while providing coordinated responses to official investigations. Secret reading societies emerged from bedroom book circulation networks, creating formal organizations dedicated to acquiring, preserving, and discussing forbidden literature. Mrs. Pemberton belongs to the Ladies' Literary Improvement Society, which meets monthly in rotating bedroom locations to discuss banned books and coordinate acquisition of new contraband titles. These societies provided intellectual community for Victorian women whose official educational opportunities remained severely limited. The long-term cultural impact of Victorian bedroom reading networks shaped intellectual development patterns that influenced later social movements and political changes. You realize that many progressive ideas that eventually gained mainstream acceptance first circulated through these domestic contraband networks, suggesting that bedroom-based forbidden reading served as an important incubation system for social change. The books hidden under Mrs. Pemberton's mattress represent seeds of intellectual revolution that would eventually transform the society that tried so desperately to suppress them. As you carefully return the forbidden volume to its hiding place, understanding that discovery could destroy not just Mrs. Pemberton, but everyone connected to her reading network. You recognize that Victorian bedroom libraries represented more than simple transgression. They were underground universities where dangerous ideas flourished in domestic secrecy, creating intellectual communities that challenged authority through the simple but revolutionary act of reading forbidden books by candlelight. You hear whispered voices coming from behind Mrs. Pemberton's dressing screen, where shadows of multiple figures move in what appears to be an intimate consultation, but the conversation reveals something far more desperate than romantic intrigue. Two women huddle over a leather medical bag containing instruments that would make battlefield surgeons wince, while Mrs. Pemberton herself lies pale and trembling on towels that will soon be stained with evidence of Victorian society's most carefully hidden crime, the termination of unwanted pregnancy. The Victorian bedroom served as the primary location for women's desperate attempts to control their reproductive destinies in an era when pregnancy often meant death, poverty, or social destruction. You observe the careful preparations these women have made. Mrs. Sarah Blackwood, a midwife whose official practice delivers babies but whose secret specialty removes them, arranges instruments with the precision of a surgeon, while Mrs. Catherine Mills, Adelaide's closest friend, provides emotional support and practical assistance for procedures that could result in execution if discovered. Birth control knowledge circulated through bedroom networks that operated with the secrecy of resistance movements, sharing information that challenged both religious doctrine and legal prohibition. Mrs. Bull. Pemberton's hidden library contains French texts describing contraceptive techniques, Dutch pamphlets illustrating barrier methods, and American treatises promoting family limitation, all materials that could result in obscenity charges if discovered by authorities. These bedroom consultations represented universities of reproductive knowledge, where women taught each other survival skills their society refused to acknowledge. Professional abortion providers developed practices that transformed Victorian bedrooms into clandestine medical facilities capable of handling procedures that official medicine condemned but desperately needed. Women secretly demanded. Mrs. Blackwood's medical bag contains instruments specifically designed for uterine intervention, flexible catheters for introducing abortifacient substances, dilating devices crafted by discreet instrument makers, and medications imported through channels that paralleled those serving the era's opium trade. The economic implications of bedroom reproductive services created shadow economies where women's desperation generated substantial profits for those willing to risk prosecution. Mrs. Blackwood commands fees equivalent to several months of working-class wages for services that require only hours to perform, reflecting both the enormous demand for reproductive control and the extreme risks associated with providing illegal medical procedures. These underground medical practices often proved more profitable than legitimate medicine. International variations in reproductive law created fascinating networks where Victorian women shared knowledge across national boundaries to access safer procedures and more effective contraceptives. Mrs. Pemberton corresponds with contacts in Holland, where contraceptive devices remain legal, and France, where abortion techniques are more advanced despite similar legal restrictions. These transnational reproductive networks operated through bedroom-to-bedroom communication that governments couldn't effectively monitor or suppress. The baby farming industry emerged as a complementary service to bedroom abortion, providing alternative solutions for women whose termination attempts failed, or who chose to carry pregnancies to term before surrendering infants. You discover correspondence between Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Waters, who operates a private lying-in establishment where unwanted babies disappear into adoption networks that ask few questions and maintain no records. These baby farming operations often served as cover for infanticide society preferred not to investigate too carefully. Women's networks for reproductive support created informal insurance systems where participants contributed resources to help each other through reproductive crises. Mrs. Pemberton belongs to a circle of 12 women who maintain a common fund for emergency reproductive services, understanding that any member might require expensive illegal medical procedures with little advance warning. These mutual aid societies provided both financial and emotional support for women navigating reproductive challenges without legal protection. The medical knowledge required for safe reproductive intervention circulated through books and pamphlets that combined accurate anatomical information with dangerous folk remedies. Mrs. Pemberton's collection includes texts describing both legitimate contraceptive techniques and potentially fatal abortion methods, creating educational resources that could save lives or destroy them depending on the reader's ability to distinguish between safe and dangerous practices. These bedroom medical libraries often represented women's only access to information about their own bodies. Religious complications around reproductive control created complex theological negotiations within Victorian households where women's survival needs conflicted with official church doctrine. Mrs. Pemberton maintains active religious participation while engaging in practices her church would consider murder, resolving this contradiction through elaborate spiritual rationalizations that emphasize divine compassion over institutional rules. These theological accommodations allowed religious women to access reproductive services while maintaining their faith commitments. The psychological trauma associated with clandestine reproductive procedures created lasting emotional consequences that Victorian women processed without professional mental health support. You observe evidence of Mrs. Pemberton's ongoing psychological distress from previous reproductive interventions, journal entries describing nightmares, guilt, and persistent anxiety that she manages through increased opium consumption and religious ritual. These emotional consequences often proved more devastating than the physical risks of illegal procedures. Historians still argue whether Victorian reproductive control networks actually provided safer alternatives to official medical neglect, or simply created additional dangers for women whose legal options had been eliminated by religious and political prohibition. The evidence suggests that bedroom-based reproductive services, despite their risks, often offered better outcomes than the complete absence of legal alternatives, but mortality rates from clandestine procedures remain substantial. Social class differences in reproductive access created stark disparities where wealthy women like Mrs. Pemberton could afford relatively safe illegal procedures, while working-class women resorted to folk remedies and self-administered interventions that frequently proved fatal. The bedroom reproductive networks primarily served families with sufficient resources to pay premium prices for discrete services, creating a two-tiered system where economic status determined survival rates for reproductive crises. The legal consequences of discovery created elaborate protection systems where reproductive service providers and clients developed mutual defense strategies against prosecution. Mrs. Blackwood maintains detailed protocols for destroying evidence, creating alibis, and providing coordinated testimony if authorities investigate her practices. These criminal defense networks operated with sophistication that matched any organized illegal enterprise. Understanding that exposure meant imprisonment or execution for all participants, technological innovations in reproductive control emerged from the intersection of medical knowledge and mechanical ingenuity, creating devices and techniques specifically adapted to bedroom use by non-medical practitioners. You discover evidence of specialized instruments designed for discrete home use, chemical preparations that could be disguised as legitimate medicines, and mechanical devices that provided contraceptive protection without requiring professional fitting. These technological developments occurred entirely outside official medical channels. The documentation required for maintaining reproductive service networks demanded careful record-keeping that balanced operational necessity with security concerns. Mrs. Blackwood maintains coded journals that track client outcomes, payment schedules, and complication rates without creating evidence that could be used for prosecutions. These underground medical records provide invaluable historical evidence about reproductive practices that official medicine refused to acknowledge or study. International medical tourism for reproductive services created opportunities for wealthy Victorian women to access safer procedures in countries with different legal frameworks. Mrs. Pemberton's correspondence reveals plans for health trips to European spas that actually provided cover for accessing legal reproductive services unavailable in Britain. These medical tourism networks operated through bedroom-based communication that arranged travel, accommodation, and medical services for women whose domestic options had been eliminated by legal prohibition. The long-term social impact of Victorian bedroom reproductive networks shaped family planning patterns and women's autonomy in ways that influenced later reproductive rights movements. You realize that the knowledge and organizational skills developed through these clandestine networks provided foundations for later political organizing around reproductive access. suggesting that bedroom-based resistance to reproductive prohibition served as training grounds for more public advocacy efforts. As Mrs. Blackwood completes her work and carefully packs her instruments, while Mrs. Pemberton recovers under Catherine's watchful care, you understand that these bedroom reproductive interventions represented more than medical procedures. They were acts of resistance against laws designed to control women's bodies, creating spaces where desperate women could access services that society simultaneously condemned and desperately needed. You feel the temperature in Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom drop several degrees as the gaslight flickers mysteriously, casting dancing shadows across walls that seem to breathe with unseen presence. The ornate mahogany table positioned at the foot of her bed isn't set for tea or correspondence. It's arranged for a séance, complete with a crystal ball, spirit board, and an assortment of mysterious implements designed to pierce the veil between the living and the dead. Tonight, this respectable Victorian bedroom transforms into a supernatural battlefield where grieving families wage war against death itself. The spiritualist movement that swept through Victorian society found its most intense expression in private bedroom séances, where families desperate to reconnect with deceased loved ones created elaborate rituals that combined religious fervour with theatrical spectacle. You observe Mrs. Pemberton's careful preparations for tonight's spirit communication session, black candles arranged in precise geometric patterns, mirrors positioned to amplify spiritual energy, and personal belongings of the deceased carefully placed to attract their restless souls back to the world of the living. Professional mediums commanded enormous fees for conducting private bedroom séances, understanding that grief made wealthy families vulnerable to promises of supernatural contact that official religion couldn't provide. Madame Petrova, tonight's spiritual facilitator, arrives with an impressive collection of mystical paraphernalia, spirit trumpets that amplify otherworldly voices, automatic writing equipment for receiving messages from beyond, and electromagnetic devices that supposedly detect supernatural presence. Her theatrical presentation combines genuine belief with calculated showmanship designed to extract maximum payment from desperate clients. The bedroom setting provided ideal conditions for supernatural theatrics because the intimate space allowed mediums to control lighting, sound, and atmosphere, while creating emotional environments where skepticism dissolved under grief's overwhelming pressure. You notice how Mrs. Pemberton has modified her bedroom specifically for spiritual work. Heavy curtains block outside light, thick carpets muffle unexpected sounds, and strategically placed furniture creates hidden spaces where Confederates might assist with supernatural effects. Victorian fascination with death photography merged seamlessly with spiritualist practices in bedroom séances, where families attempted to capture photographic evidence of supernatural visitation. Mrs. Pemberton has hired Mr. Blackwell, a photographer who specializes in spirit photography, to document tonight's séance using equipment supposedly calibrated to detect otherworldly presence. These sessions often produced mysterious images that believers interpreted as proof of life after death, but skeptics recognized as darkroom manipulation. Women's participation in bedroom spiritualism reflected broader patterns of female empowerment disguised as supernatural activity. Mrs. Pemberton and her female friends found in spiritualist practices opportunities to express opinions, make decisions, and exercise authority that Victorian society normally reserved for men. Speaking as vessels for departed spirits, These women could voice controversial ideas about politics, religion, and social reform, while attributing their statements to supernatural sources rather than personal conviction. The international character of Victorian spiritualism created fascinating cultural exchanges as bedroom seances incorporated mystical traditions from around the world. Mrs. Petrova claims Russian Orthodox spiritual training, but her practices blend Native American sage burning, Hindu meditation techniques, and ancient Egyptian symbolism into eclectic ceremonies that would have horrified traditional religious authorities. These syncretic spiritual practices created new forms of religious expression that operated entirely outside official church control. Children's participation in family seances created unique educational experiences that combined religious instruction with psychological trauma in ways that Victorian parents rarely considered problematic. You observe how the Pemberton children have been included in tonight's ceremony, expected to contribute their innocent spiritual energy to facilitate contact with their deceased grandmother. These childhood exposures to supernatural practices often shaped lifelong beliefs about death, religion, and the nature of reality itself. The economics of private spiritualism created substantial underground economies where grief generated significant profits for practitioners willing to exploit families' desperate need for supernatural comfort. Mrs. Petrova charges fees equivalent to several months of working-class wages for single seances, while ongoing spiritual development programs could cost families amounts that exceeded annual household budgets. These financial commitments often continued for years as families became addicted to supernatural contact with deceased relatives. Scientific investigations of spiritualist phenomena created fascinating intersections between emerging psychological research and popular supernatural beliefs. You discover correspondence between Mrs. Pemberton and members of the Society for Psychical Research, who have arranged to study tonight's séance using newly developed scientific instruments designed to detect electromagnetic anomalies or photographic evidence of spiritual presence. These early paranormal investigations represented serious attempts to apply scientific methodology to supernatural claims. Historians still argue whether Victorian spiritualism represented genuine religious innovation or elaborate psychological coping mechanisms that helped families process grief without challenging traditional religious authority. The evidence suggests that bedroom seances served important psychological functions regardless of their supernatural validity, providing structured rituals for expressing grief and maintaining emotional connections with deceased loved ones in ways that formal religion often failed to accommodate. Religious conflicts created by spiritualist practices generated complex theological debates within Victorian households where supernatural communication challenged orthodox Christian beliefs about death and afterlife. Mrs. Pemberton maintains active church membership while conducting seances that her minister would consider blasphemous, resolving this contradiction through elaborate theological arguments that emphasize divine love over institutional doctrine. These spiritual accommodations allowed religious families to pursue supernatural practices while maintaining their traditional faith commitments. The technology employed in Victorian bedroom seances represented fascinating attempts to apply emerging scientific discoveries to supernatural investigation. Mrs. Petrova's equipment includes primitive electromagnetic detectors, chemical preparations that supposedly reveal spiritual presence, and optical devices designed to enhance perception of otherworldly phenomena. These technological applications created hybrid practices that combined ancient mysticism with modern scientific pretensions. Gender dynamics in spiritualist practices created unprecedented opportunities for Victorian women to exercise spiritual authority in domestic spaces where they normally possessed little power. Female mediums like Mrs. Petrova commanded respect and substantial payment from male clients who would never have acknowledged women's authority in other contexts. These supernatural leadership roles provided alternative career paths for women whose other professional options remained severely limited by social convention. The psychological manipulation techniques employed by professional mediums required sophisticated understanding of human psychology and grief processing that rivaled contemporary therapeutic knowledge. You observe how Mrs. Petrova reads subtle emotional cues from family members, gathering information through conversation that she later presents as supernatural revelation. These psychological skills often proved more valuable than any genuine mystical abilities in creating convincing supernatural experiences for grieving clients. International networks among spiritualist practitioners created global communities where supernatural techniques and mystical knowledge circulated through correspondence that operated like modern professional associations. Mrs. Petrova maintains contact with mediums across Europe and America, sharing methods for producing supernatural effects, comparing client management strategies, and coordinating responses to skeptical investigations. These professional networks provided mutual support for practitioners whose work operated outside legal and religious approval. The documentation produced during Victorian bedroom seances created fascinating historical records that reveal family dynamics, grief processing patterns, and religious beliefs in ways that conventional sources rarely captured. Mrs. Pemberton maintains detailed journals of supernatural communications, recording messages from deceased relatives that provide insights into family relationships, unresolved conflicts, and emotional needs that survivors couldn't express through conventional channels. Legal implications of spiritualist practices created complex questions about fraud, religious freedom, and consumer protection that Victorian authorities struggled to address effectively. Mrs. Petrova operates in legal grey areas where supernatural claims couldn't be definitively proven false, but financial exploitation of grieving families clearly violated emerging consumer protection principles. These legal ambiguities allowed spiritualist practices to flourish while creating occasional prosecution risks for practitioners who made overly specific promises about supernatural results. As the seance reaches its climax and Mrs. Petrova begins channeling what she claims is the spirit of Mrs. Pemberton's deceased mother, delivering messages that comfort the living while extracting substantial fees for supernatural services, you realize that Victorian bedroom spiritualism represented more than religious practice. It was a complex industry that monetizes grief while providing psychological services that mainstream religion and emerging psychology couldn't yet offer to families desperate for comfort in their darkest hours. You enter Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom to find a scene that would disturb modern sensibilities beyond comprehension. The lifeless body of 7-year-old Constance, who succumbed to scarlet fever 3 days ago, has been carefully positioned in an ornate chair beside the window, her glassy eyes staring sightlessly at the camera while her grieving mother adjusts the child's burial dress one final time. The photographer, Mr. Ashworth, crouches behind his massive equipment, preparing to capture what may be the only photograph this family will ever possess of their beloved daughter. Post-mortem photography, known euphemistically as memorial portraiture or sleeping pictures, represented one of the Victorian era's most haunting traditions, transforming bedrooms into photography studios where death became art and grief became commerce. You observe the elaborate preparations required for these sessions, cosmetics applied to simulate the bloom of life, wireframes hidden beneath clothing to maintain natural poses, and careful lighting arrangements designed to minimize the obvious signs of death, while creating images that families could treasure as final mementos. The technical challenges of photographing corpses in Victorian bedrooms required specialized equipment and expertise that created entirely new photographic specializations. Mr. Ashworth's camera equipment weighs nearly 200 pounds and requires precise calibration to capture clear images in the dim gaslight that preserves the illusion of peaceful sleep. These photographers developed unique skills in lighting dead subjects, positioning lifeless bodies, and creating compositions that suggested rest rather than death. Victorian families commissioned post-mortem photographs not from morbid fascination, but from practical necessity. Many children died before families could afford professional portraits, making death photography their only opportunity to possess visual records of beloved family members. You examine Mrs. Pemberton's collection of memorial photographs, discovering images of relatives who died at various ages, each carefully preserved in elaborate frames that transform death portraits into domestic shrines, where families could maintain visual connections with deceased loved ones. The economics of death photography created substantial business opportunities for photographers willing to specialize in this emotionally demanding work. Mr. Ashworth charges premium rates for memorial portraiture because the work requires immediate availability, specialized technical skills, and emotional resilience that most photographers couldn't maintain. These death photography specialists often earned more from memorial work than from conventional portrait sessions. Understanding that grief made families willing to pay extraordinary prices for final visual memories, professional death photographers developed elaborate techniques for creating lifelike appearances in corpses that had begun showing obvious signs of decay. You observe Mr. Ashworth's collection of specialized cosmetics, wire supports, and positioning devices designed to simulate natural poses and healthy complexions. These technical innovations required understanding of both photographic science and mortuary preparation that created hybrid professional skills found nowhere else in Victorian society. International variations in post-mortem photography reflected different cultural attitudes toward death, childhood, and visual memorialization. American frontier families often posed deceased children with living siblings, creating family portraits that included both the living and the dead, while European practitioners developed more elaborate theatrical techniques that transformed death into artistic compositions. You discover evidence that Mrs. Pemberton studied American memorial photography techniques through correspondence with photographers in Boston and Chicago. The psychological impact of participating in death photography sessions created complex, emotional experiences for surviving family members who struggled to balance grief with the practical requirements of creating lasting visual memories. Mrs. Sissom said that Pemberton's journal describes the strange mixture of comfort and horror she experienced during previous memorial photography sessions, finding solace in preserving visual records while being traumatized by the elaborate deceptions required to make death appear peaceful. Children's roles in family death photography revealed Victorian attitudes toward mortality education and emotional processing that differed dramatically from modern approaches. You observe how the surviving Pemberton children participate in positioning their deceased sister, handling her lifeless body with matter-of-fact acceptance that suggests routine familiarity with death and post-mortem rituals. These childhood exposures to death photography often shaped lifelong attitudes toward mortality and visual representation. The technological evolution of photography during the Victorian era created new possibilities for memorial portraiture that transformed death documentation from simple record-keeping into elaborate artistic expression. Mr. Ashworth's equipment represents the latest innovations in portable photography, allowing for bedroom sessions that would have been impossible with earlier photographic technology. These technological advances made death photography accessible to middle-class families who previously couldn't afford memorial portraits. Religious implications of death photography created theological debates within Victorian families where visual representation of the deceased challenged traditional beliefs about spiritual departure and bodily resurrection. Mrs. Pemberton reconciles her Anglican faith with memorial photography through elaborate theological arguments that emphasize divine love and family continuity. Understanding that these visual records serve spiritual as well as emotional functions in maintaining connections with deceased family members. Historians still argue whether Victorian death photography represented healthy grief processing or unhealthy denial of mortality that prevented families from accepting loss and moving through normal mourning stages. The evidence suggests that memorial portraits served important psychological functions by providing tangible connections to deceased loved ones. But some families became obsessed with death imagery in ways that may have prolonged rather than resolved their grief. The artistic evolution of post-mortem photography during the Victorian era reflected broader changes in visual culture and aesthetic sensibilities that transformed death documentation from simple record-keeping into sophisticated artistic expression. You examine examples of Mr. Ashworth's work that demonstrate increasing artistic sophistication, elaborate compositions, careful attention to lighting and background, and creative poses that transform death portraits into compelling visual narratives about family love and loss. Professional death photographers often develop close relationships with families who required their services repeatedly, as infectious diseases claimed multiple children within short periods. Mr. Ashworth has photographed 3 previous Pemberton family deaths, creating visual records that chronicle the family's ongoing struggle with childhood mortality while developing intimate understanding of their specific preferences for memorial portraiture composition and presentation. The preservation methods required for maintaining death photographs created specialized archival practices that treated these images as sacred family documents requiring careful protection from deterioration. Mrs. Pemberton stores her memorial photograph collection in specially designed albums with acid-free papers and protective sleeves. Understanding that these visual records represent irreplaceable connections to deceased family members whose physical graves may be forgotten, but whose photographic presence can be preserved indefinitely. Social class differences in death photography access created disparities where wealthy families could afford elaborate memorial portraits while working-class families relied on simple documentation that captured basic visual records without artistic enhancement. The Pemberton family's ability to employ Mr. Ashworth's premium services reflects their social status while creating memorial photographs that serve as status symbols as well as grief processing tools. The legal and ethical implications of death photography created complex questions about consent, exploitation, and appropriate representation of deceased individuals who couldn't participate in decisions about their visual memorialization. Victorian society developed informal protocols for death photography that balanced family grief needs with social propriety concerns, creating practices that honored the deceased while meeting survivors' emotional requirements. International trade in death photography equipment and techniques created global networks where memorial portraiture specialists shared methods for creating lifelike appearances in deceased subjects, and preserving photographic images that could withstand long-term storage. Mr. Ashworth maintains correspondence with death photographers across Europe and America, exchanging technical innovations and artistic approaches that improved memorial portraiture quality while expanding professional opportunities. The cultural legacy of Victorian death photography influenced later attitudes toward mortality documentation and grief expression that shape 20th century approaches to death and remembrance. You realise that these bedroom photography sessions represented more than simple record keeping. They created visual languages for expressing love, loss, and family continuity that continued influencing memorial practices long after post-mortem photography became culturally unacceptable. You discover a small stack of letters tied with black ribbon hidden in Mrs. Pemberton's jewellery box, and the elegant handwriting on the envelopes immediately reveals that these aren't ordinary correspondence. They're love letters written on expensive paper with gold embossed letterheads, but the return address belongs not to Miss Pemberton, but to his business partner, Lord Ashford. As you carefully untie the ribbon, understanding that you're handling evidence that could destroy 3 families and topple a commercial empire, you realise that Victorian bedrooms served as headquarters for romantic conspiracies that generated the era's most devastating blackmail schemes. The illicit romance between Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton and Lord Ashford represents just one thread in the vast web of forbidden relationships that flourished behind Victorian society's moral facade, creating networks of secrets so dangerous that entire fortunes were built and destroyed through strategic revelation or concealment of bedroom indiscretions. You examine the passionate correspondence that details not only romantic meetings, but also financial arrangements, political favours, and family secrets that transform private love affairs into weapons of mass social destruction. Professional blackmailers emerged as a distinct criminal class during the Victorian era, specialising in gathering intelligence about bedroom scandals and converting romantic secrets into steady income streams that could support luxurious lifestyles without requiring traditional employment. Mrs. Violet Ashworth operates one of London's most sophisticated blackmail enterprises from her respectable Mayfair townhouse, employing networks of servants, photographers, and private investigators who document adultery with the precision of military intelligence operations. The technology available for documenting bedroom scandals created new possibilities for evidence gathering that transformed Victorian adultery from whispered rumours into photographically verified facts. You discover Mrs. Ashworth's collection of specialised surveillance equipment, cameras designed for discreet operation, listening devices that could be concealed in bedroom furniture, and even primitive motion detection systems that automatically photographed anyone entering monitored rooms. These technological innovations made Victorian adultery far more dangerous than previous generations had experienced. International networks among blackmail specialists created global markets where scandals could be monetized across national boundaries, allowing Victorian blackmailers to threaten exposure in foreign newspapers or social circles that victims couldn't control or influence. Mrs. Ashworth maintains correspondence with blackmail specialists in Paris, New York, and Vienna, creating international pressure systems where wealthy victims face potential exposure in multiple countries simultaneously, making escape or resistance virtually impossible. The psychology of Victorian blackmail required sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, family relationships, and economic pressures that created complex leverage systems extending far beyond simple adultery documentation. Mrs. Ashworth's blackmail files reveal detailed analyses of victims' financial situations, political ambitions, and family vulnerabilities that allow for perfectly calibrated extortion demands designed to extract maximum payment without driving victims to desperate measures like suicide or murder. Religious complications created by bedroom scandals generated unique blackmail opportunities where Victorian families' public piety could be weaponized against their private transgressions. Mrs. Pemberton's affair with Lord Ashford becomes particularly valuable to blackmailers because both families maintain prominent positions in Anglican church hierarchy, making exposure devastating not only to their social standing but also to their religious authority and charitable work that employs hundreds of people. The economics of Victorian blackmail created shadow financial systems where sexual secrets generated steady income streams that rivaled legitimate business enterprises in their profitability and reliability. Mrs. Ashworth's accounting records reveal blackmail income exceeding £30,000 annually, an amount that places her among Britain's highest earners despite her complete lack of traditional business activities. These blackmail fortunes often proved more stable than legitimate investments because human nature guaranteed steady demand for secrecy services. Women's participation in blackmail enterprises reflected broader patterns of female entrepreneurship in illegal industries that provided economic opportunities unavailable through conventional Victorian employment. Mrs. Ashworth commands respect and substantial income through blackmail work that utilizes social skills, psychological insight, and strategic thinking that society typically discouraged in women. These criminal enterprises often empowered Victorian women in ways that legal employment never could achieve. The legal implications of Victorian blackmail created complex jurisdictional problems where bedroom scandals often involved parties from different social classes, geographical regions, and even countries, making prosecution difficult and creating safe havens for blackmail specialists who understood how to exploit legal boundaries. Mrs. Ashworth operates in legal grey areas where proving criminal intent remains difficult and where victims often prefer paying blackmailers to pursuing prosecution that would publicise the very scandals they're trying to conceal. Professional protection services emerged to help wealthy Victorian families defend against blackmail threats, creating counterintelligence operations that rivaled government spy networks in their sophistication and reach. Lord Ashford employs Mr. Blackwood, a discreet investigator who specialises in neutralising blackmail threats through evidence destruction, counter-blackmail operations, and occasionally more direct interventions that ensure threatening parties no longer pose problems to his clients. The social impact of blackmail scandals created ripple effects throughout Victorian society as bedroom indiscretions destroyed political careers, business partnerships, and family fortunes in ways that reshaped entire communities. You examine newspaper clippings documenting the spectacular collapse of the Worthington textile empire after bedroom photographs surfaced, showing the family patriarch in compromising positions with his son's wife, creating financial chaos that eliminated thousands of jobs and devastated entire industrial regions. Historians still argue whether Victorian blackmail networks actually increased or decreased adultery rates by creating either deterrent effects through fear of exposure or perverse incentives through the excitement of forbidden romance enhanced by danger. The evidence suggests that blackmail threats may have made Victorian adultery more, rather than less common, by creating underground communities where shared vulnerability created bonds stronger than conventional social connections. International legal variations created fascinating opportunities for Victorian blackmail specialists who understood how to exploit different national attitudes toward adultery, privacy, and criminal prosecution. Mrs. Ashworth's operations extend to British colonial territories where different legal frameworks and social hierarchies create unique blackmail opportunities involving military officers, colonial administrators, and local aristocrats whose scandals could influence imperial policy. The technological evolution of Victorian blackmail paralleled broader developments in photography, telecommunications, and transportation that made evidence gathering easier, while also making victims more vulnerable to exposure across greater geographical distances. Mrs. Ashworth's latest equipment includes telephonic listening devices, portable cameras capable of indoor photography, and rapid postal services that allow for nearly instantaneous communication with blackmail targets regardless of their location. Gender dynamics in Victorian blackmail revealed fascinating power inversions where female blackmailers often targeted male victims whose social and economic power couldn't protect them from scandal exposure. Mrs. Ashworth's client list includes members of Parliament, military officers, and industrial magnates who submit to extortion demands from a woman they would never acknowledge as their social equal under normal circumstances. The documentation requirements for successful blackmail operations created elaborate record-keeping systems where Victorian blackmailers maintained files more detailed than government intelligence services. Mrs. Ashworth's archives contain thousands of photographs, correspondence samples, financial records, and surveillance reports that create comprehensive portraits of her victims' private lives, representing information databases that could reshape British society if ever made public. The long-term social consequences of Victorian bedroom blackmail extended far beyond individual victims to influence political decisions, business practices, and social reforms as powerful individuals modified their behaviour to avoid creating additional blackmail vulnerabilities. You realise that Mrs. Ashworth and her fellow blackmail specialists wielded informal political power that often exceeded that of elected officials, shaping Victorian society through strategic revelation and concealment of bedroom secrets. As you carefully retie the black ribbon around Mrs. Pemberton's incriminating correspondence, understanding that these letters represent loaded weapons in the ongoing war between Victorian public morality and private reality, you recognise that bedroom love affairs served as more than romantic escape. They created complex economies of secrecy where passion generated profits for criminal entrepreneurs who understood that Victorian society's greatest weakness was its inability to reconcile human nature with moral pretension. You approach Mrs. Pemberton's elaborate dressing table, where crystal bottles gleam like jewels in the gaslight, but the beauty of these containers masks contents so toxic they could kill with a single generous application. The ornate silver hand mirror reflects not just her face but the deadly reality of Victorian beauty standards. Cosmetics containing arsenic, lead, mercury, and other poisons that promised ethereal beauty while delivering slow, agonizing death to women desperate to achieve the era's impossible aesthetic ideals. Victorian women pursued beauty through chemical warfare against their own bodies, applying cosmetics that modern toxicologists would classify as weapons-grade poisons. You examine Mrs. Pemberton's collection of Fowler's Solution, an arsenic-based complexion treatment that promised the pale, translucent skin Victorian society prized above all other feminine attributes. Each daily application delivered doses of arsenic that accumulated in organs and bones, creating the ghostly pallor that was actually a symptom of chronic poisoning rather than natural beauty. The arsenic complexion industry generated enormous profits for entrepreneurs who understood that Victorian beauty standards created insatiable demand for products that delivered the appearance of consumption. the romantic wasting disease that supposedly indicated refined sensibility and spiritual elevation. Mrs. Pemberton's medicine cabinet contains multiple arsenic preparations. Dr. Mackenzie's harmless arsenic complexion wafers, Levison's arsenic soap, and Blanc de Perle face powder containing enough poison to eliminate small animals with each evening's beauty ritual. Professional beauty consultants emerged during the Victorian era to guide women through the complex process of achieving fashionable appearances while minimizing immediate health consequences. Mrs. Violet Fairfax, Adelaide's beauty advisor, visits monthly to assess complexion progress and adjust arsenic dosages based on skin response and social season requirements. These beauty professionals commanded substantial fees while providing services that slowly murdered their clients through accumulated poisoning disguised as cosmetic enhancement. The international trade in beauty poisons created global supply chains where toxic substances traveled from manufacturing centers to bedroom dressing tables through networks that paralleled legitimate pharmaceutical distribution. Mrs. Pemberton's arsenic supplies arrived from factories in Germany and France, where chemical production operated under fewer regulatory restrictions than British manufacturing, allowing for higher concentrations of active poisonous ingredients in cosmetic preparations. Lead-based cosmetics represented another pillar of Victorian beauty poison, with white lead face paints providing the stark pallor that suggested aristocratic indoor living rather than vulgar outdoor labour. You discover Mrs. de Pemberton's collection of lead-based preparations. Phoenician Carou's face paint containing lead concentrations that would horrify modern safety inspectors, and various rouge preparations using mercury compounds to create the subtle flush that indicated delicate health rather than robust vitality. The mercury beauty treatments popular among Victorian women created neurological damage that manifested as personality changes often attributed to feminine hysteria rather than heavy metal poisoning. Mrs. Pemberton's collection includes mercury-based eye cosmetics that promised lustrous gazes while destroying vision, and mercury skin treatments that delivered temporary luminosity at the cost of permanent neurological impairment. These beauty poisons created generations of women whose mysterious ailments reflected systematic chemical assault disguised as cosmetic enhancement. Victorian hair care products contained chemical cocktails that would challenge modern hazardous waste disposal protocols, while promising the elaborate coiffures that served as status symbols among wealthy women. You examine Mrs. Pemberton's hair treatment collection, lead-based hair dyes that promised fashionable colours while causing brain damage, mercury pomades that delivered lustrous styling while destroying follicles, and arsenic-based hair tonics that supposedly promoted growth while ensuring eventual baldness through systematic poisoning. The beauty device industry created mechanical torture instruments disguised as cosmetic enhancement tools, transforming Victorian bedrooms into chambers where women submitted to physical modification procedures that combined vanity with masochism. Mrs. Pemberton's dressing table displays an impressive collection of beauty contraption, facial massage devices that delivered electrical shocks, mechanical nose reshaping tools that promised refined profiles through sustained pressure, and waist compression systems that redistributed internal organs to achieve fashionable silhouettes. Dental beauty treatments represented perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Victorian cosmetic poisoning, with tooth care products containing mercury, lead, and other toxins that destroyed gums, jawbones, and nervous systems while promising attractive smiles. Mrs. Pemberton's dental care collection includes mercury-based tooth powders that dissolved enamel while promising whiteness. lead-based gum treatments that caused jawbone necrosis, and arsenic mouthwashes that delivered breath freshness along with systematic organ damage. The psychology of Victorian beauty poisoning revealed complex relationships between feminine identity, social status, and self-destruction that created cultural environments where women enthusiastically participated in their own slow murder while believing they pursued health and attractiveness. Mrs. Pemberton's beauty journal documents her awareness of negative health effects from cosmetic use, alongside her determination to continue treatments that maintain her social position and feminine identity. Historians still argue whether Victorian women understood the health consequences of their beauty treatments, or remained genuinely ignorant of the connection between cosmetic use and mysterious ailments that plagued fashionable ladies throughout the era. The evidence suggests that many women suspected connections between beauty treatments and health problems, but prioritized social acceptance over physical welfare, creating cultural suicide pacts disguised as feminine vanity. Medical professionals of the era often facilitated beauty poisoning by prescribing arsenic mercury and lead preparations as legitimate medical treatments while ignoring obvious connections between cosmetic use and patient symptoms. Morrison, the Pemberton family physician, regularly prescribes arsenic-based treatments for Adelaide's nervous constitution, while failing to recognise that her symptoms result from the very treatments he recommends, creating medical iatrogenesis that systematically destroyed patients through professional incompetence. The social pressure to maintain poisonous beauty standards created peer networks where Victorian women encouraged each other's participation in systematic self-destruction while providing emotional support for shared suffering. Mrs. Pemberton belongs to a beauty circle where women compare cosmetic techniques, share supplier recommendations, and normalise the health consequences of chemical beauty treatments through collective denial and mutual encouragement. Religious complications arose when Victorian beauty treatments conflicted with Christian teachings about vanity and bodily modification, creating theological debates about feminine duty, natural appearance, and spiritual virtue. Mrs. Pemberton reconciles her Anglican faith with poisonous beauty treatments through elaborate theological arguments that emphasize wifely duty and social responsibility over personal vanity, allowing her to maintain both religious devotion and cosmetic poisoning without conscious hypocrisy. The economic implications of beauty poisoning created substantial underground economies where women's desperation for attractive appearances generated profits for entrepreneurs willing to manufacture and distribute lethal cosmetics disguised as luxury goods. The Victorian beauty industry understood that repeated use of toxic products created dependent customers whose deteriorating health required increasingly expensive treatments, generating sustainable revenue streams based on systematic customer destruction. International variations in beauty poisoning reflected different cultural attitudes toward feminine appearance, health risks, and regulatory oversight that created fascinating geographical differences in cosmetic toxicity levels. American beauty products often contained higher concentrations of active poisons than European equivalents, while colonial territories provided access to exotic toxins unavailable in domestic markets, creating global hierarchies of cosmetic danger. The technological evolution of beauty poisoning during the Victorian era reflected broader advances in chemical manufacturing and pharmaceutical production that made more potent toxins available to domestic consumers at lower costs. Mrs. Pemberton's latest cosmetic acquisitions represent cutting-edge poison delivery systems that combine multiple toxic substances in single preparations, creating cosmetic weapons of unprecedented lethality disguised as luxury beauty treatments. The long-term health consequences of Victorian beauty poisoning created generational effects where mothers transmitted toxic burdens to children through pregnancy and breastfeeding, spreading cosmetic damage across family lines in ways that influenced hereditary health patterns. You realise that Mrs. Pemberton's beauty treatments may affect not only her own health, but also that of her children and grandchildren, creating family legacies of chemical damage disguised as feminine vanity. As you observe Mrs. Pemberton applying her evening beauty ritual, layering arsenic-based face cream, mercury eye cosmetics, and lead-based rouge with the devotion of religious ceremony, you understand that Victorian beauty treatments represented more than cosmetic enhancement, but systematic cultural suicide where entire generations of women participated in their own destruction while believing they pursued the feminine perfection that their society demanded at any cost. You descend the narrow servants' staircase behind Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom, following the sound of muffled sobbing that leads to a cramped chamber where 10-year-old Mary, a scullery maid, huddles on a straw mattress barely large enough for her tiny frame. Her hands are cracked and bleeding from scrubbing floors with lye soap. Her back bears fresh welts from this morning's beating, and her hollow eyes reflect malnutrition that would shock modern child welfare advocates. This hidden world of exploited children exists just steps away from the opulent master bedroom, creating a system of domestic slavery that Victorian society preferred to ignore rather than address. The Victorian mansion's elaborate bedroom quarters concealed networks of child exploitation that rivaled any industrial factory in their systematic abuse of young workers, whose legal status provided virtually no protection against employers who viewed children as disposable labour resources. You discover that the Pemberton household employs 14 children between ages 8 and 15, housing them in basement chambers so cramped that each child possesses less living space than Mrs. Pemberton's wardrobe, while working them 16-hour days that begin before dawn and end after midnight. Professional child labour brokers operated sophisticated trafficking networks that supplied wealthy Victorian households with young workers whose poverty made them vulnerable to exploitation that bordered on slavery. Mr. Grimsby, who supplies the Pemberton family with domestic staff, maintains detailed records of available children categorised by age, physical capability, and expected lifespan under harsh working conditions. These human trafficking operations generated substantial profits while providing wealthy families with expendable labour that could be replaced when children died or became too damaged for continued service. The economic incentives driving Victorian child labour created perverse systems where children's suffering generated savings that funded wealthy families' luxurious lifestyles. Mrs. Pemberton's household budget reveals that child labour costs represent less than 5% of annual expenses, while providing services that would require adult staff costing 10 times as much. These economic calculations transform children into commodity inputs whose value derived entirely from their capacity for exploitation rather than their humanity. International variations in child labour regulation created opportunities for wealthy Victorian families to access particularly vulnerable children through networks that exploited legal differences between countries and colonial territories. The Pemberton family's child workers include refugees from Irish famine, orphans from London workhouses, and even children purchased from families in British colonial territories where local laws provided even fewer protections than domestic regulations. The physical abuse of child servants followed systematic patterns designed to maximise productivity while minimising visible evidence that might attract unwanted attention from authorities or visitors. You observe the careful distribution of bruises and injuries on Mary's body, concentrated on areas normally covered by clothing, applied with implements that left minimal scarring, and timed to allow healing before family social events where servants might be observed by outsiders who could report abuse. Medical neglect of child servants created health crises that wealthy families addressed through abandonment rather than treatment. Understanding that replacing sick children cost less than providing medical care for workers whose lives possessed no economic value beyond their labour capacity. Mrs. Pemberton's household records document multiple child deaths attributed to natural causes that modern medicine would recognise as preventable conditions exacerbated by malnutrition, overwork, and deliberate medical neglect. The psychological trauma inflicted on child servants created lasting damage that Victorian society addressed through increased punishment rather than therapeutic intervention. Understanding that broken spirits produced more compliant workers even as they destroyed human potential, Mary's behavioural responses, flinching at sudden movements, inability to make eye contact, and complete emotional shutdown represent classic symptoms of complex trauma that her employers interpret as signs of proper training rather than psychological destruction. Sexual exploitation of child servants represented perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Victorian domestic abuse, with young workers possessing no legal recourse against employers who viewed their bodies as additional property to be used according to adult preferences. You discover evidence suggesting systematic sexual abuse of female child servants in the Pemberton household, creating additional layers of exploitation that combined labour trafficking with sexual predation disguised as domestic employment. The educational deprivation imposed on child servants ensured that victims remained trapped in exploitative systems by preventing development of skills or knowledge that might enable escape from domestic servitude. Mary cannot read, write, or perform basic mathematics beyond counting, ensuring that she remains dependent on employers who provide subsistence living in exchange for total control over her labour, time, and physical safety. Religious justifications for child labour exploitation created theological frameworks that allowed wealthy Victorian families to reconcile Christian beliefs with systematic abuse of vulnerable children. Mrs. Pemberton maintains that providing employment to poor children represents Christian charity that saves them from worse fates, creating moral rationalizations that transform exploitation into virtue, while absolving employers of responsibility for workers' suffering. Historians still argue whether Victorian child labour in wealthy households represented systematic abuse or reflected era-appropriate employment practices that provided opportunities for poor children who possessed no alternative means of survival. The evidence suggests that domestic child labour often proved more exploitative than industrial employment because household workers possessed fewer legal protections and less public visibility than factory workers whose conditions attracted reform attention. The legal framework governing child servants provided virtually no protection against abuse, while creating elaborate systems for protecting employers against accusations of mistreatment. Victorian law recognised children as property of their employers rather than individuals with rights, allowing masters to inflict punishment that would constitute criminal assault if applied to adults, while facing no legal consequences for systematic abuse disguised as legitimate discipline. Professional child welfare advocates who attempted to investigate domestic abuse faced systematic obstruction from wealthy families who possessed political connections and financial resources sufficient to prevent external scrutiny of their employment practices. The few reformers who gained access to households like the Pembertons often found that children had been coached to deny abuse or temporarily relocated to prevent documentation of exploitation. The social networks among wealthy families created mutual protection systems where employers shared information about avoiding child welfare investigations while coordinating responses to reform efforts that threatened their access to exploitative labour. Mrs. Pemberton corresponds with other wealthy women about managing child servants, sharing techniques for maintaining control while minimising visible evidence of abuse that might attract unwanted attention. International humanitarian networks began documenting Victorian child labour abuse through correspondence between reform organisations that operated across national boundaries to expose exploitation that domestic authorities preferred to ignore. These early human rights organisations created pressure for reform by internationalising awareness of child labour conditions that wealthy families had successfully concealed from local scrutiny. The technological innovations that improved adult working conditions during the Victorian era rarely extended to child servants, who continued performing dangerous tasks using primitive equipment that frequently caused injuries, disabilities, and deaths that employers attributed to natural accidents rather than workplace negligence. Mary's scarred hands result from cleaning machinery without safety equipment that wealthy families could easily afford but chose not to provide for disposable workers. The long-term social consequences of Victorian child labour exploitation created generational cycles of abuse where traumatised children grew into adults whose psychological damage made them either perpetrators or victims of continued exploitation. The few child servants who survived to adulthood often possessed such severe psychological damage that they remained trapped in systems of exploitation that had destroyed their capacity for independent functioning. Gender differences in child labour exploitation revealed that female child servants faced additional vulnerabilities through sexual abuse that made their employment even more dangerous than that of male workers. While society's failure to recognise or address sexual violence against children ensured that female servants possessed no protection against predatory employers who understood that their victims possessed no legal standing to report abuse. The documentation of child labour abuse remained deliberately minimal because wealthy families understood that written records could be used as evidence against them if reform movements gained sufficient political power to investigate domestic employment practices. The absence of comprehensive records makes historical assessments of Victorian child labour abuse difficult, while suggesting that documented cases represent only small fractions of actual exploitation. As you watch Mary return to her pre-dawn kitchen duties, her tiny frame struggling with tasks that would challenge adult workers, you realise that Victorian mansion bedrooms existed in moral proximity to child labour camps that would shock modern human rights advocates, creating domestic environments where extreme luxury coexisted with systematic child abuse through economic systems that treated vulnerable children as expendable resources whose suffering funded the comfortable lives of families who preferred not to acknowledge the human cost of their domestic arrangements. You notice an unusual mechanical contraption attached to 15-year-old Edmund Pemberton's bed, a complex system of leather straps, metal rings, and alarm mechanisms designed to prevent any nighttime hand movement that might result in what Victorian physicians considered the era's greatest health crisis. Masturbation, the elaborate device, called a surgical appliance for the prevention of self-abuse, represents just one element in a comprehensive bedroom surveillance system that transformed adolescent sleeping quarters into monitoring stations where parents waged war against their children's natural sexual development. Victorian society's obsession with preventing masturbation created an entire industry dedicated to designing, manufacturing, and installing bedroom devices that would make modern torture specialists envious in their ingenuity and cruelty. You examine Edmund's complete anti-masturbation system, spiked metal rings that cause excruciating pain if genitals become aroused, electrical shock devices triggered by an attempt at self-stimulation, and monitoring equipment that alerts parents to any suspicious bedroom activity. These contraptions transform children's most private spaces into mechanical prisons designed to prevent normal human sexuality. The medical establishment's support for anti-masturbation devices reflected Victorian physicians' profound ignorance about human sexuality, combined with their willingness to profit from parents' fears about children's moral and physical development. Dr. Harrison, the family specialist in adolescent moral hygiene, regularly inspects Edmund's anti-masturbation equipment while prescribing additional restraints and monitoring devices that supposedly prevent the physical deterioration that physicians attributed to self-stimulation. Professional anti-masturbation device manufacturers created elaborate product lines that transformed bedroom surveillance into profitable enterprises targeting parents desperate to protect their children from imaginary health threats. The Pemberton family's equipment comes from Whiteley's Surgical Appliance Company, which produces specialized catalogs featuring dozens of restraint devices, monitoring systems, and punishment mechanisms designed to eliminate adolescent sexuality through technological intervention and psychological intimidation. International variations in anti-masturbation technology created fascinating markets where Victorian families compared restraint systems across national boundaries while seeking the most effective methods for preventing children's sexual development. Edmund's devices include American-manufactured electrical shock system, German-engineered mechanical restraints, and French-designed monitoring equipment, creating international collaborations in the systematic torture of adolescent sexuality. The psychology behind anti-masturbation campaigns revealed Victorian society's profound anxiety about human sexuality, particularly the recognition that sexual desire emerged naturally during adolescence regardless of moral instruction or religious training. Parents who installed bedroom surveillance systems like Edmund's understood instinctively that sexuality represented forces beyond their control, leading to increasingly desperate technological solutions designed to suppress natural human development through mechanical intervention. Religious justifications for anti-masturbation devices created theological frameworks that transform bedroom surveillance into Christian duty while providing moral cover for systematic torture of children whose only crime was normal sexual development. Mrs. Pemberton maintains that protecting Edmund from self-abuse represents maternal obligation blessed by divine authority, creating religious rationalizations that transform child abuse into virtue, while absolving parents of responsibility for psychological damage inflicted through sexual surveillance. The economic implications of the anti-masturbation industry created substantial markets where parents' fears generated profits for entrepreneurs willing to manufacture and install torture devices disguised as medical equipment. The Victorian anti-masturbation trade generated millions in revenue while creating employment for specialists in adolescent surveillance, device maintenance, and moral hygiene consultation that represented entirely new professional categories based on systematic child abuse. Female anti-masturbation devices revealed gender-specific approaches to controlling adolescent sexuality that reflected Victorian assumptions about feminine nature and sexual capacity. Edmund's sister Margaret possesses her own restraint system designed specifically for female anatomy, including devices that prevent genital touching, monitor vaginal arousal, and deliver punishment for any signs of sexual interest. These gender-specific torture systems created different but equally damaging approaches to eliminating normal sexual development. The medical literature supporting anti-masturbation intervention contained elaborate pseudoscientific theories that attributed virtually every adolescent health problem to self-stimulation, while prescribing increasingly extreme prevention methods. Victorian physicians published detailed studies claiming that masturbation caused insanity, physical deformity, moral corruption, and early death, creating scientific legitimacy for bedroom surveillance systems that terrorized entire generations of adolescents. Historians still argue whether Victorian anti-masturbation campaigns represented genuine medical beliefs or reflected deeper cultural anxieties about sexuality. Personal autonomy and social control disguised as health concerns. The evidence suggests that anti-masturbation hysteria served multiple social functions beyond sexual control, creating opportunities for technological surveillance that normalized invasive monitoring while establishing precedents for intimate personal supervision that extended far beyond bedroom activities. The technological evolution of anti-masturbation devices during the Victorian era reflected broader advances in mechanical engineering and electrical systems that created increasingly sophisticated torture mechanisms disguised as medical equipment. Edmund's latest restraint system represents cutting-edge Victorian technology applied to sexual suppression, including pressure sensors that detect arousal, electrical circuits that deliver measured punishment, and recording devices that document compliance with anti-masturbation protocols. International medical conferences dedicated to anti-masturbation research created global networks where physicians shared techniques for preventing adolescent sexuality while developing increasingly extreme intervention methods. Dr. Harrison attends annual conferences in Vienna and Berlin where medical professionals demonstrate new restraint technologies, compare patient outcomes, and coordinate research into more effective methods for eliminating normal sexual development through technological intervention. The psychological damage inflicted by anti-masturbation devices created lasting trauma that Victorian society addressed through increased surveillance rather than therapeutic intervention. Understanding that sexually damaged adults proved easier to control than those who developed normal sexual autonomy during adolescence. Edmund's behavioral responses, sexual anxiety, self-hatred, and complete emotional shutdown around intimacy topic represent classic symptoms of sexual trauma that his parents interpret as evidence of successful moral training. Professional installation and maintenance of anti-masturbation systems created specialized trades where craftsmen developed expertise in bedroom surveillance while maintaining discretion about families' private sexual monitoring activities. Mr. Blacksmith, who installs and maintains the Pemberton family's anti-masturbation equipment, operates a thriving business serving wealthy families who require technical support for their domestic sexual surveillance operations. The social networks among families using anti-masturbation devices created mutual support systems where parents shared experiences, compared equipment effectiveness, and coordinated responses to reform movements that criticize sexual surveillance of children. Mrs. Pemberton corresponds with other mothers about managing adolescent sexuality, sharing techniques for maintaining sexual control while minimizing visible evidence of abuse that might attract criticism from emerging child welfare advocates. Legal protections for parents using anti-masturbation devices on their children reflected Victorian legal systems that prioritize parental authority over children's physical safety, allowing systematic torture disguised as moral instruction while providing no recourse for victims of sexual surveillance. Edmund possesses no legal standing to object to his restraint system, and removal of the devices would require parental consent that his mother refuses to provide based on religious and medical advice. The long-term sexual consequences of Victorian anti-masturbation campaigns created generational patterns of sexual dysfunction, anxiety, and relationship problems that influenced family dynamics and social development in ways that extended far beyond individual victims. Adults who survive childhood. Sexual surveillance often possessed such severe psychological damage that they proved incapable of normal intimate relationships, creating cycles of sexual dysfunction that affected entire family lines. Educational institutions' support for anti-masturbation campaigns created school-based surveillance systems that extended bedroom monitoring into academic environments, ensuring that children face sexual surveillance in every aspect of their lives. Edmund's boarding school maintains its own anti-masturbation protocols that coordinate with family systems, creating comprehensive sexual monitoring that eliminates any possibility of normal adolescent sexual development. The cultural legacy of Victorian anti-masturbation hysteria influenced 20th century attitudes towards sexuality, privacy, and personal autonomy in ways that shaped modern approaches to adolescent development and sexual education. You realise that bedroom anti-masturbation devices represented more than sexual control, but systematic efforts to eliminate human sexual autonomy through technological surveillance that normalised intimate monitoring while creating precedents for invasive personal supervision. As you observe Edmund preparing for another night of mechanical sexual surveillance, his young body trapped within restraint systems designed to prevent normal human development, you understand that Victorian anti-masturbation campaigns represented humanity's most systematic attempt to eliminate sexuality through technological torture, creating bedroom prisons where children's natural development was sacrificed to adult anxieties about sexual autonomy that threatened social control systems built upon sexual repression and psychological domination. You discover a hidden compartment beneath Mrs. Pember's floorboards, containing documents that reveal her involvement with the secretive Order of the Silver Dawn, an underground organisation whose members gather monthly in rotating bedroom locations to plan what they euphemistically call social improvements, but which actually constitute elaborate schemes for eliminating inconvenient individuals who threaten their financial and political interests. Tonight's meeting agenda, written in coded language, discusses the permanent resolution of labour organisers who have been disrupting the Pemberton textile mills, while also planning the unfortunate accident that will befall a journalist investigating their opium import operations. Victorian secret societies flourished in the bedrooms of wealthy families who understood that their economic dominance required occasional elimination of threatening individuals through methods that appeared accidental rather than criminal. You examine Mrs. Pemberton's extensive correspondence with fellow society members, revealing a network that spans from parliamentary members to colonial administrators, all united by their willingness to commit murder when legal methods prove insufficient for protecting their privileges and profits. The Order of the Silver Dawn operates with sophisticated organisational structures that rival government intelligence agencies in their compartmentalisation, security protocols, and operational effectiveness. Mrs. Pemberton holds the rank of Sacred Guardian, responsible for coordinating elimination operations in the northern industrial regions, while maintaining plausible deniability through elaborate cover stories and carefully constructed alibis. These bedroom-based criminal enterprises required professional-level planning and execution capabilities that challenged stereotypes about Victorian women's intellectual limitations. Professional assassination services emerged to serve wealthy Victorian families whose secret society memberships required periodic elimination of threatening individuals through methods that appeared natural rather than criminal. Mr. Cornelius Ashford, the society's primary operative, specializes in creating accidental deaths that satisfy both criminal objectives and social appearances, commanding substantial fees for services that remove inconvenient people while protecting clients from criminal prosecution or social suspicion. International networks among Victorian secret societies created global conspiracies, where bedroom-based organisations coordinated elimination operations across national boundaries while sharing techniques for political murder disguised as natural death. Mrs. Pemberton's correspondence reveals connections with similar organisations in France, Germany, and America, creating transnational criminal enterprises that could eliminate threats regardless of geographical location or national jurisdiction. The psychology behind Victorian secret society participation revealed complex motivations where wealthy individuals combined genuine social anxiety with criminal opportunism. Understanding that their privileged positions required occasional violence to maintain against increasing democratic pressures, Mrs. R. Pemberton's private journal describes her evolution from social reformer to criminal conspirator, documenting the psychological transformation that converted charitable impulses into murderous calculation. Religious complications arose when secret society activities conflicted with Christian teachings about murder and moral responsibility, creating theological debates within organizations whose members attempted to reconcile faith with systematic killing. The Order of the Silver Dawn maintains its own chaplain, Reverend Dr. Whitmore, who provides religious justification for elimination operations while offering spiritual absolution for members whose criminal activities challenge their religious convictions. The economic implications of secret society operations created shadow economies where political murder generated substantial profits for operatives while protecting wealth that legitimately earned billions for society members. Mrs. Pemberton's accounting records reveal payments for assassination services that exceeded annual household budgets, reflecting both the enormous value placed on eliminating threats and the premium pricing commanded by professional killers willing to serve wealthy clients. Suicide epidemic investigations revealed disturbing patterns where individuals threatening powerful interests died through apparent self-inflicted injuries that actually resulted from secret society elimination operations designed to appear voluntary rather than criminal. You discover evidence that the recent suicide of Labour organiser Thomas Mitchell actually resulted from society intervention, with Mr. Ashford arranging circumstances that made murder appear like depression-driven self-destruction. Female participation in secret society assassination networks challenged Victorian assumptions about women's capacity for violence, while creating opportunities for ladies to exercise lethal power that conventional society denied them. Mrs. Pemberton and her female colleagues demonstrate sophisticated understanding of poison administration, accident arrangement, and psychological manipulation that rivals any professional criminal organization in its effectiveness and ruthlessness. The technological innovations employed by Victorian secret societies included communication systems, surveillance equipment, and elimination methods that represented cutting-edge criminal technology disguised as legitimate scientific research. Mrs. Pemberton's equipment includes chemical preparations that simulate natural death, mechanical devices that create believable accidents, and communication systems that coordinate operations while maintaining security against official investigation. Historians still argue whether Victorian secret societies actually influenced major political and economic decisions or represented elaborate fantasies where wealthy individuals convinced themselves they possessed more power than reality supported. The evidence suggests that bedroom-based criminal organizations achieved significant operational success while creating psychological benefits for members who found purpose and excitement through participation in elaborate conspiracy networks. Legal immunity for secret society members operated through corruption networks that extended from local police to parliamentary leadership, ensuring that criminal investigations faced systematic obstruction when they threatened wealthy conspirators. Mrs. Pemberton's files contain detailed information about bribing officials, manipulating evidence, and controlling jury selection that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of criminal justice system vulnerabilities. The social consequences of secret society operations extended far beyond individual victims to influence labor relations, political representation, and economic development in the ways that shaped entire regional development patterns. You examine newspaper clippings documenting the mysterious deaths of reform advocates, the convenient accidents that eliminated threatening competitors, and the strange illnesses that struck investigators who pursued cases too aggressively. International legal variations created opportunities for Victorian secret societies to exploit jurisdictional boundaries when eliminating threats who possessed protection in their home countries, but remained vulnerable when travelling to territories where society members enjoyed greater influence. Mrs. Pemberton's correspondence reveals coordination with colonial administrators who arranged tropical fever deaths for British critics who visited territories where different legal frameworks enabled elimination operations. Professional training for secret society operatives included instruction in chemistry, psychology, and mechanical engineering that created criminals whose technical capabilities exceeded those of most legitimate professionals. Mr. Ashford's qualifications include chemical engineering from Cambridge, medical training from Edinburgh, and mechanical expertise acquired through apprenticeship with master craftsmen, creating assassination capabilities that combined multiple technical disciplines. The recruitment methods employed by Victorian secret societies targeted wealthy individuals whose financial interests aligned with criminal objectives while screening candidates for psychological willingness to participate in elimination operations. Mrs. Pemberton underwent extensive evaluation before achieving full membership, including demonstration of her commitment through participation in practice operations that eliminated less significant threats while proving her reliability for major assignments. Child exploitation within secret society operations created additional layers of criminal activity where young servants became unwitting participants in assassination schemes through their access to target households and their invisibility to adult security awareness. Mary, the young scullery maid, unknowingly delivered poisoned food preparations during society operations, illustrating how criminal organizations exploited vulnerable children as elimination tools. The documentation requirements for secret society operations balanced operational necessity with security concerns, creating coded record systems that tracked elimination success while protecting members from criminal prosecution. Mrs. Pemberton's journals use domestic metaphors to describe murder operations. Spring cleaning indicates elimination assignments, redecorating suggests evidence destruction, and entertaining guests describes assassination planning meetings. Counterintelligence operations emerged as reform movements developed, their own secret organizations dedicated to exposing and disrupting elite criminal networks through infiltration, evidence gathering, and protective services for threatened individuals. These competing secret societies created underground wars where bedroom-based organizations fought for control over political and economic development, while using elimination tactics against each other. The long-term political impact of Victorian secret society operations influenced democratic development, labour relations and social reform in ways that shaped 20th century political evolution, through elimination of reform leaders and intimidation of potential activists. You realise that many progressive movements face systematic assassination campaigns that eliminated leadership while creating climate of fear that discouraged political participation among reformers. As you carefully return Mrs. Pemberton's incriminating documents to their hiding place, understanding that discovery could result in your own addition to the Society's elimination list, you recognise that Victorian bedroom secret societies represented more than criminal conspiracy, but systematic efforts to maintain aristocratic power through murder disguised as natural death, creating shadow governments that ruled through terror while maintaining facades of respectable social leadership that concealed their willingness to kill anyone who threatened their privileged position. You discover the final hidden chamber behind Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom, where photographer Mr. Jeremiah Blackwell maintains his secret studio, a dark room equipped not just for conventional portraiture but for documenting the most disturbing evidence of Victorian society's hidden crimes. The walls are lined with photographs that would destroy governments if they ever saw daylight. Cabinet ministers engaged in acts that would end careers, industrial magnates participating in rituals that would shock their shareholders, and religious leaders committing sins that would empty their churches. This is where the era's darkest secrets were preserved in silver and light, creating an archive of evidence that held an entire civilization hostage to its own hypocrisy. Victorian society's most dangerous profession wasn't that of soldier or explorer, but photographer, specifically those who specialised in documenting the evidence that powerful people desperately needed to hide. Mr. Blackwell represents the era's ultimate power broker, wielding a camera instead of a sword, understanding that in an age of moral pretension, photographic truth possessed more destructive capability than any weapon ever manufactured. His bedroom studio contains the visual evidence that could topple the British Empire, destroy the Anglican Church, and revolutionise industrial capitalism through simple revelation of what actually occurred behind closed doors. The technological revolution in photography during the Victorian era created unprecedented opportunities for evidence preservation that transformed blackmail from rumour-based extortion into fact-based financial enterprises. Mr. Blackwell's equipment represents the cutting edge of photographic science, cameras capable of indoor operation, chemical processes that captured clear images in minimal light, and printing techniques that produced multiple copies of incriminating evidence for distribution across international networks of financial and political manipulation. Professional photographers who specialised in scandal documentation developed skills that combined artistic capability with criminal expertise, creating hybrid professionals who understood both the technical requirements of image creation and the financial opportunities presented by visual evidence of moral transgression. Mr. Blackwell commands fees that exceed those of the era's most successful portrait artists, understanding that photographs of powerful people's private activities possessed value that transcended any artistic consideration. International markets for scandalous photography created global networks where Victorian photographers shared techniques, coordinated operations, and distributed evidence across national boundaries to maximise pressure on powerful victims who might otherwise escape consequences for their private behaviour. Mr. B. Blackwell maintains correspondence with photographers in Paris, Vienna, and New York, creating transnational evidence-sharing networks that could destroy individuals regardless of their geographical location or political connections. The psychology of Victorian scandal photography revealed complex motivations where photographers balanced artistic ambition with criminal opportunity. Understanding that documenting society's hidden truths required both technical skill and moral flexibility that few professionals possessed. Mr. Blackwell's personal journal describes his evolution from conventional portraitist to scandal specialist, documenting the psychological transformation that converted artistic passion into profitable criminality. Religious implications of scandal photography created theological complications where visual evidence challenged official moral teachings, while providing undeniable proof of religious hypocrisy that threatened institutional authority. Mr. Blackwell's collection includes photographs of prominent Anglican clergy engaged in activities that would destroy their religious credibility, creating evidence that could reshape British religious authority through simple photographic revelation. The economics of scandal photography created substantial underground economies where visual evidence generated profits that exceeded those of most legitimate businesses, while creating employment opportunities for technical specialists willing to document society's hidden crimes. Mr. Blackwell's accounting records reveal annual income that places him among Britain's highest earners, reflecting the enormous value that powerful people placed on controlling photographic evidence of their private activities. Child exploitation photography represented perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Victorian scandal documentation, with photographers capturing evidence of abuse that could destroy perpetrators while creating additional trauma for victims whose suffering became commodified through visual reproduction. Mr. Sir Blackwell's most secure files contain photographs that document systematic child abuse in wealthy households, creating evidence that could revolutionize child protection while traumatizing victims through permanent visual documentation of their suffering. The preservation methods required for maintaining scandal photography archives demanded sophisticated technical knowledge about chemical stability, storage conditions, and security measures that protected valuable evidence while ensuring long-term access for blackmail operations. Mr. Blackwell has invested in specialized storage equipment that maintains photographic integrity while protecting archives from fire, moisture, and unauthorized access that could compromise their evidential value. Female participation in scandal photography networks revealed opportunities for Victorian women to exercise power through documentation and distribution of evidence that challenged male authority, while creating income opportunities unavailable through conventional employment. Several of Mr. Blackwell's associates are women who specialize in accessing female-only spaces where male photographers couldn't operate, creating comprehensive documentation networks that transcended gender boundaries. Historians still argue whether Victorian scandal photography actually influenced political and social development or simply reflected existing corruption without creating meaningful change in power structures that scandal exposure might have been expected to reform. The evidence suggests that photographic documentation often reinforced rather than challenged existing hierarchies by creating mutual blackmail systems that protected all participants from consequences rather than exposing individual criminals. The technological evolution of Victorian photography enabled increasingly sophisticated surveillance capabilities that transformed scandal documentation from occasional opportunity into systematic intelligence gathering that could monitor entire social networks for blackmail and political manipulation purposes. Mr. Blackwell's latest equipment includes portable cameras that could be concealed in everyday objects, allowing for covert documentation that victims never suspected was occurring. International legal variations in photography regulation created opportunities for Victorian scandal photographers to exploit jurisdictional differences when documenting evidence that might be legal in some countries but criminal in others, creating complex legal environments where photographic evidence possessed different values depending on geographical location and legal framework. Mr. Blackwell specializes in understanding these legal variations to maximize protection for his operations while ensuring evidence remained legally valid for blackmail purposes. The social consequences of scandal photography extended far beyond individual victims to influence political decisions, business practices, and social reforms as powerful individuals modified their behavior to avoid creating photographic evidence that could be used against them. You realize that Mr. Blackwell and his fellow scandal photographers possessed informal political power that often exceeded that of elected officials through their ability to document and distribute evidence of private behavior. Professional photography guilds emerged to provide mutual protection for scandal specialists who faced legal prosecution while creating industry standards for evidence documentation that ensured photographic evidence met legal requirements for criminal prosecution or civil litigation. These professional organizations operated like criminal enterprises while maintaining facades of legitimate artistic associations. The psychological impact of living under photographic surveillance created anxiety levels among Victorian elites that influenced everything from residential architecture to social entertainment patterns, as powerful people modified their lifestyles to minimize opportunities for incriminating documentation. Wealthy families began designing homes with fewer windows, employing additional security personnel, and limiting social gatherings that might create opportunities for scandal photography. The long-term cultural legacy of Victorian scandal photography influenced 20th century attitudes toward privacy, media ethics, and political accountability in ways that shaped modern approaches to investigative journalism and evidence documentation. You understand that Mr. Blackwell's bedroom studio represented the birthplace of modern paparazzi culture, creating precedents for using photography as a weapon of social control and political manipulation. Counter-surveillance technologies emerged as powerful individuals developed methods for detecting and preventing scandal photography through technical innovations that could identify hidden cameras, interfere with photographic equipment, and protect private activities from unwanted documentation. These technological arms races between photographers and their targets drove innovation in both surveillance and counter-surveillance capabilities. As you examine Mr. Blackwell's final photograph, a haunting image of Mrs. Pemberton herself captured in a moment of private anguish that reveals the profound human cost of living within Victorian society's web of secrets, surveillance, and systematic deception. You realize that these bedroom photographers preserved more than scandal evidence, but created visual records of an entire civilization's moral collapse, documenting through silver and light the inevitable human consequences of building society upon foundations of carefully maintained lies. The soft gaslight finally dims in Mrs. Pemberton's bedroom as morning approaches, and you understand now why Victorian bedrooms held such carefully guarded secrets. These weren't simply private spaces, but command centres for lives lived in constant contradiction between public virtue and private reality. Behind every perfectly appointed chamber lay evidence of humanity's eternal struggle between the people we pretend to be and the people we actually are. The wallpaper that concealed hidden compartments